Welcome back to the Network of Networks workshop at SESYNC. Our next session is called Existing Models and Inspiring New Networks of Networks. For this session, we have two speakers, which will focus on existing models, common and unique challenges, and best practices across disciplines. Our first speaker is Dr. Leslie Reese, Assistant Professor, Department of Biology, Georgetown University. Dr. Reese is a macrosystems ecologist who studies how large-scale changes in climate and land use impact biological communities with a focus on butterflies. As part of her research program, she leads the North American Butterfly Monitoring Network, which provides support, outreach, and opportunities for collaboration to people involved in the collection, curation, and use of North American butterfly monitoring data. She is also a member of a new global consortium, Butterfly Net. Leslie was a research fellow at SESYNC for 4 years before moving to Georgetown in 2015. Welcome, Leslie.
So, there we go. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's great to be back at SESYNC. I'm going to be talking about some of the network that I work with, but in particular one that was started right here when I was at SESYNC and through some of the support that they gave me. I was not familiar with ExcelNet, although it's been great to hear about it, and I'd like to learn more. And what I'm going to be talking about today is really from the perspective of a tenure-track research professor. Because I hear a lot of you in this room, you're actually the head of a network, you work for an institution, you have the ability and the institutional support to hopefully support your network. But a lot of times when you're coming in as a professor, there are a lot of challenges that have to do with the fact that supporting and being in a network is not necessarily part of the role of the professor. A lot of times your administrators don't understand the different challenges that are coming at you. So what I'm going to be talking about is really some vignettes that touch on some of the topics that have already been brought up and that many of the people in this room are already going to be familiar with. So especially speaking to people who are thinking of starting networks and some of the challenges and rewards. So as was already said, I study global change. I'm a global change biologist, but I lead a network of butterfly monitoring networks. And just to give you a little history of why I do that is when I first really wanted to get into this the research of looking at global change and impacts on butterflies in particular, I realized that there were a lot of citizen science groups out there monitoring butterflies, but that most of them did not have the functional capacity to manage or share their data. And so I had to decide, do I want to play that role or do I want to shift literally to a different research topic? And so I made the decision, back when I was a postdoc, that I wanted to try to take this on. And again, I actually had a history working actually in customer service, which I think, made me somewhat suited to do this work. So I was able to start this network, again, here at SESYNC, and I want to share a little bit about why I think that project was successful, especially in light of some of the challenges that often come. So first of all, I had just received funding to start a big infrastructure to support certain types of butterfly monitoring, although interestingly, that initial grant from NSF, I was told specifically, we don't think you should try to start this network of regional butterfly monitoring groups because we don't think that you can get them to agree on the things that they need to agree on. So that's just too high risk. Don't do that. And when I came to SESYNC, I said, I want to try to do this anyway, and I was able to get a lot of support. And the interesting thing, I think, is that Most of these groups are started by museums or butterfly houses. It is a different culture than academic culture. And when the academic world tries to come together with these citizen science groups, sometimes there's a clash of cultures. And the interesting thing about this is almost all of the sort of difficult issues revolved around disagreements about taxonomy. And I only bring that up because it's an easy thing to dismiss, like who cares about taxonomy? But these people really cared. And I honestly think that the reason that I was ultimately successful in bringing these groups together, getting a shared vision, and developing a system that supported all of them by having them all come in and, in this initial meeting we had in 2012, right here at SESYNC, is that I realized that I had to tell them right from the get-go, you can use any taxonomic authority that you want. And honestly, that is still one of the things that has kept this group being super friendly with each other. It's a really positive group. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about these networks. So the network that I'm talking about is the North American Butterfly Monitoring Network. It has a sister group of networks that monitor specifically the monarch butterfly. And I want to make a slight distinction between people that maybe take a picture and upload it to iNaturalist. That's a type of citizen science. But these are all networks of people doing structured surveys. So it is a network of networks. So like the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, the Michigan Butterfly Monitoring Network, the Texas Butterfly Monitoring Network are groups that recruit volunteers to go out, set up permanent transects, and survey those transects. I also work with this group ButterflyNet that I'll talk a little bit about, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about this group called CUBES, which is a network of people trying to bring data and math into the undergraduate biology curriculum. So I actually work with lots of different networks. I've worked with an international network of butterfly monitoring networks throughout Europe, and that has led me to want to start a new network of people looking at global climate change and butterflies in Mediterranean ecosystems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because this is an aspirational network, something that I'm thinking of putting together right now. And I'm just going to share a little bit about some of the things that I think about going into this network. So first of all, the reason I'm even able to potentially put this network together is because I've become so entrenched in the sort of global network of groups that monitor butterflies. And I know that world very well, and everybody knows me as well. And the reason I focused in on Mediterranean systems here is for two reasons. One, many of the global hotspots are in Mediterranean systems. And also, for whatever reason, there are a lot of these butterfly monitoring networks that use very similar protocols in these systems. And I don't know if so we've got the longest running network since 1972 in Northern California. We've got a network that's been running since 2011 in Southern California, one in Catalonia that's been running since 1996, and one in Israel, actually, that also came to the original meeting here in 2012 that's been running since 2009, and one that's recently started in South Africa. And even though there's not a formal butterfly monitoring network, there's such a great history of collecting this natural history information in Australia that we could potentially pull in this Australian group as well. And, for my research goals, the reason this is so beneficial is I'm really interested in developing general mechanistic models. And by working across multiple systems, you're forced to try to figure out what's the difference and what's the same about the system. And so from my perspective, the reason this is so enticing as a potential network to develop is because there are a lot of shared ecological factors in these different parts of the world. Yet they have completely different communities. And so it will help me reach my goal of trying to do this kind of research on a platform that forces me to generalize. But then I also have to realize, and right now we're just in the exploration phase where we have money to bring together this big group of people just to talk. And so going into it, I have to realize that at the end of the day, we may not end up with the same goals, and we may or may not be able to put together a network. If that makes sense. And that there are two really different groups. Once again, there's the butterfly monitoring networks, which often have different goals from the local academic institutions who might be wanting to take those data and do research. And so the question is, are we going to be able to bring these people together and find enough of a shared mission that it's actually worth it to develop this network of networks? And then even from my own standpoint, I have to ask, do I want to lead another network? Because this takes a ton of time and energy, and it's time and energy that is often not appreciated by the administrators or my colleagues in my department. So here are some of the characteristics that were already mentioned, and what I was going to do was go through and just sort of give you some vignettes of experiences I have that touch on each one of these factors. And after listening to the morning session, I'm going to try to focus in on a few key sort of issues that I think came up. So first of all is engagement has to be integral to the success of activities. And right here is a really tiny screenshot of our main platform that we ended up building that all these different butterfly monitoring groups use to manage their data. And the fact that they all manage their data on a shared network has not, and it's free, has not only freed them up to do more recruitment and quality control, but many new networks have come online since we've developed this network. I realized that if we were going to do this, we had to get everyone on the same page because we couldn't create 10 systems, we could only create one system. And, by bringing everyone together and realizing that the one thing that people were not going to budge on was the taxonomic authority, we were able to take that into account from day one and build something that works for everybody. And so that's been super successful. One thing I just wanted to bring up about the group in Europe, which I've also worked really closely with, is it's really interesting to see how the cultural boundaries in Europe actually ended up being stronger than here in the US. And it ended up being sort of a reflection of the fact that these are different countries, as opposed to us where we're in different states. And it was kind of funny the way each person from the various butterfly monitoring groups kind of reflected the stereotypes of their country, including me. I was like the loudest person there. But, you realize that even amongst a bunch of European butterfly monitoring networks, there were a lot of really interesting cultural divides. I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to talk about this again. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Butterfly Monitoring Network and why I think that's been so successful. So again, we had this foundational meeting in 2012 right here. As a group, we came up with these 6 goals. And these 6 goals are still our goals. And some of them we've met really, really well, and others are still aspirational. And I still feel like all the people who are part of this growing network are still on board with these particular goals. And that everybody in this network benefits from all of this. And that is what has made working with this network the easiest network I work with, and the most successful, and also the most joyful. Like, I love our meetings. I love everybody in it. It's because our interests align really, really closely. Now, I work in other networks where our interests do not align so closely, but that doesn't mean those networks don't work. It just means it's harder. It's harder to make it work. And you really have to have everybody's interest at heart, I think, to be a successful member of these networks. And again, I'll use the example here. The reason I started this was because I wanted their data. Like, literally, that was the only reason I did it, is because I wanted their data. But if I had gone in with that attitude, it never would have worked. And I had to be truly, truly dedicated to the greater good of what this network would produce for everybody. And if I wasn't going to be prepared to do that, even though the thing that I get measured on is research output, and research output and money brought in, it just wasn't going to be successful. And so, you know, you have to really ask yourself, am I getting into this just to serve myself? Which is fine, like we serve ourselves when we get into these groups, but you also have to have part of your aspirations, part of your goal to really serve a greater good, or it probably isn't going to work very well. I wanted to talk a little bit about Cubes, which is a network of people who initially started to bring math into the undergraduate curriculum. And I've done a lot myself over the past 10 years of trying to bring data-intensive approaches into the undergraduate biology curriculum. So everyone was like, oh, you know, you should work with Cubes and BioQuest because they're bringing math into the undergraduate curriculum. And I would say, this is where the epistemology comes in. I'm like, math is not actually the same as data-intensive processes. Those are two completely different things. So I would go, you know, I went to my first BioQuest meeting right here, and I was like, this doesn't really fit what I'm doing. Then a few years later, they were like, we're finally doing data. Come to our workshop. And I went to the workshop, and I'm like, yeah, you're doing data, but it's not big data. It's just regular old data. So it's still not really fitting. And it's finally just this summer that they finally had a workshop that was focused specifically on data analytics, you know, and what I would consider my role in science is more as a data scientist, and that's the approach we take to research. And so now finally this group that I've been sort of going on the outskirts of for many, many years, all of a sudden things have aligned, and they're like, oh, we're so glad you're here, and you obviously have a lot of experience bringing these kinds of things into the classroom, and even just articulating the difference between what does it mean to bring data versus data science into the classroom. What are the skills you need to be a scientist who collects data versus a scientist who uses pre-existing large data sets to answer questions for which those data were not originally collected. And so finally, I feel like after a lot of many years, this collaboration is finally going to kind of take off. I've already kind of talked about this. You want to leverage those resources for mutual benefit. Honestly, if everyone's not benefiting, it's going to be hard to keep that network together. And the other thing is that especially for me, and this includes me, all of this work gets done, in the margins of people's time. And so that means you have to be very forgiving when people say they're going to do something and don't quite get to it. I wanted to end, this will be said over and over, but face-to-face meetings, super important. I want to say a couple of things about platforms before I end, because this has ended up being a really important factor in how these groups work. And first, I want to reflect something that Margaret said, which is that there are so many platforms out there, and right now Slack is like the big thing. And a lot of these platforms are brilliant and they do a great job. But the reality is that if you're a collaborative researcher, you probably work in several collaborative research groups. And I work in several collaborative research groups. And people just suffer from platform overload. And it doesn't matter how great the platform is and how well it works for you. This is, again, another situation where if you don't get buy-in, just use email and Google Docs. It may not, if you can get everyone to buy in to using Slack or using some other workflow management system, that's great. But if you can't, just realize that you can't force people to be on that system, and it just may not work. But sometimes the system really is key, and so I work on this butterfly net project where we're trying to use the international network of collaborators to extract butterfly traits. And so it took the first 2 years of us fighting about whether or not we wanted to hire web developers to create a system that would work, which is what I wanted to do. And everyone else was just like, that's crazy, I can get my postdoc to do it or my grad student to do it. And I would be like, okay, do it. Get your grad student to do it. Get your postdoc to do it. I could do it myself in 4 hours. Okay, do it. Do it. Put it up there and let's all start using it. And at the end of the day, even though this costs $20,000 and not 4 hours of someone's time, this has been the key to make this particular activity work. And so, you know, you have to think about when you actually need the platforms, and if it is it worth spending the money to get somebody who knows what they're doing? And so I'll end on that kind of note, which is that if you're going to lead a network, you have to realize that you're bringing in all these different actors because they're bringing something in that you can't. You have to be willing to hear their perspectives and not try to just get people to agree with you and sign on to the program that you want to do. And that creating and maintaining networks is a skill in and of itself, and it's an activity that you do. And if you don't enjoy that activity of bringing people together and getting them to work together and finding that right mix of people, then running a network may be something that you end up not enjoying very much. For me, I love my networks, but it is a lot of work. And, you know, so I would just sort of leave people with this idea of don't think it's a shortcut to getting something done that you want to get done. It really is an activity in and of itself that takes a lot of care and love and investment. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Jessica.
Okay, so we'll hold questions to the end, and then we'll take questions from in the room and remotely for both speakers. So our second speaker is Dr. Jessica Vitak, Associate Professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. She's also the Director of the Center for the Advanced Studies of Communities and Information, and Associate Director of the Human-Computer Interaction Lab. Her research evaluates the benefits and drawbacks of mediated communication by focusing on the role that social and technical affordances shape interactions online.
Thank you, Carrie. So I'm going to talk today about some of my experiences running labs, centers, international collaborations, and networks. I really appreciated Claire's distinction in her talk between groups and networks. And I think it's a very messy, blurry space. So a lot of what I do, I wouldn't necessarily classify as a network, but I think the core of networks is collaboration. And how do you do successful collaboration? I have a lot of experience succeeding and failing at that. So I'm going to share some of both of those today. A little bit of background on myself. Already heard the main thing. I'm over at the University of Maryland, just down the street. I'm in an iSchool. College of Information Studies is known as an iSchool. Lots of people have no idea what an iSchool is. iSchools are interdisciplinary programs. A lot of them emerged out of library science. But what they're really focused on is the important research questions at the intersection of information, people, and technology. And so with that, we draw people from all kinds of disciplinary backgrounds. So, for example, I'm a social scientist by training. We have, I'm from communication as my PhD. We have people from psychology, sociology. We have English, education, computer science, engineering. All of these people who, you know, if in a traditional disciplinary system probably would never talk, we've all come together and we make it work. And iSchools across the U.S. work by figuring out what works for them. I really appreciate the interdisciplinarity because the types of research that I do are not discipline specific. And when you have those types of problems, you need people with different perspectives, people bringing different theories, different methods, all of that. So I am here because I have a lot of experience with different types of centers and labs. I'm going to talk both about CASCI and the HCIL. I also manage it's a very informal network of people who do research on what we call networked privacy in the 21st century, when it's digital, when it's reliant not just on you, but also on other people and on the systems themselves. That's probably around 100 people around the world who are in that network. And then I've done international research on NSF-funded projects, and I am going to talk about one of my other NSF grants that involves very complex collaboration. Leslie showed this slide, so I'm going to skip by this, but I'm going to do a similar approach to what she did, really kind of taking some of these characteristics of networks and breaking them out and giving my own experiences and how that works or doesn't work. So, okay, I already mentioned CASCI and HCIL. Pervade is an NSF large grant that myself and 6 others received 2 years ago. So these are $3 million 5-year projects, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we're 7 people from 6 institutions working on issues around pervasive data, and then the network privacy listserv I already mentioned. So let me go through these a little bit. CASCI is an interdisciplinary group that is within an interdisciplinary department at Maryland, and I've included the mission statement here. You don't necessarily need to read that, but it's a lot about information and organization broadly conceived. And so what we find is that every week, every Tuesday, we hold either we bring somebody in to give a talk, or we do a reading. And people who are in CASCI suggest readings, and those readings are often outside of your home discipline because they're reflecting that person. So the reading groups provide a great opportunity for us to get to learn about what people who are doing similar research but from a different perspective are talking about. And we find that we get all kinds of folks from around campus who are involved in CASCI, including things like environmental science and geographical sciences, life sciences, as well as kind of the players you would expect with a group like this. We try to do a lot of cross-campus networking. One of the challenges, I think, both in academia and in industry is how do you get people who are in different departments, who are working in different spaces to talk to each other, to have this kind of serendipitous, oh, wow, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. And so CASCI is providing one avenue for folks to do that who are doing similar research. The Human-Computer Interaction Lab, HCI, our HCIL is the oldest human-computer interaction lab in the country. Let's see here. We just had our 36-year anniversary this year, so we were established in the early 80s, and we've been doing some of the really important HCI research. The lab it's a lab. It's called a lab. I don't know if other people have experienced this. There's this huge debate at Maryland about whether you're a center or a lab or, all these other names for things. I think we're more than a lab, but we're not a center. Anyway, seriously, like these titles just get in the way. CASCI is definitely not a center according to the university, yet it has center in the name. So if you're not familiar with HCI research, what that's really centered on is how do we improve the way people interact with technology, user-centered design, user experience, those types of things. One of the coolest things I think about the HCIL, and this is probably on another slide, is that, again, we've been around for well over 30 years, so we've had hundreds of students go through who worked with the HCIL. And a great example of how our influence has spread is we have a subset of the HCIL called Kids Team. Kids Team has existed for 21 years. Every year they bring in a group of between 5 and 10 kids who are ages 8 to 11. And they come in twice a week during the school year, and then there's a 2-week summer camp. And what they're doing is they're working on design for products targeted at kids. So a really popular example was when Nickelodeon was remodeling its website. They came to us and they worked with the kids about what that design would be. Well, folks who worked on Kids Team when they were PhD students then went and got jobs, and now there are Kids Team locations at the University of Baltimore and the University of Washington, and they're all doing great research as well. And what this is really focused on is transforming the idea that if you're building toys for kids or building websites for kids or other things for kids that you know best. Well, maybe you should get kids insights. And this idea of co-design was just not something that was really practiced much before the 1990s, especially when it was with children, because better than children was the prevailing attitude. And so this is really force people to recognize that kids do have valuable insights when it comes to figuring out what's going to work and not work for them. So I'm going to talk about some more specific examples, but again, we meet every week in person, the whole lab. We find that when we provide free lunch, more people show up, shockingly enough. We can have about 50 to 60 people most weeks coming to this. I'll probably talk more about the annual symposium, and we do a lot of alumni and social events because this is a large network of both current and former folks who are working with the lab. With Pervade came together a few years ago, emerging out of what I would say another network, CSST, which, Steve, Consortium for the Study of Socio-Technical?
Consortium for the
Science of Socio-Technical, which is
by a committee.
yes, which is an amazing group of folks, and this grant proposal emerged out of that. And we think of it as a collaboratory, so it's this idea there's 7 of us, 6 institutions at 7 different places around the U.S., and somehow we managed to get a lot of work done. Again, this goes back to, like, if you don't have dedicated resources to just organizing and managing things, this would never have happened, because you can't rely on me to be the person to be organizing this stuff. I have too much other stuff going on. But I'll give some examples of how that's working. And then I really already mentioned this. The big thing with this group of privacy researchers is we've been forming and evolving over the last decade, and a lot of this is due to the fact that at least once a year we have a workshop at one of the major conferences. There's maybe 5 conferences that we've done workshops at that are on various topics related to network privacy, and that's allowed the network to grow. That's allowed the folks who maybe were more junior early on to take more senior positions as organizers of workshops to push what they want to be talked about. It's allowed us to have these 1 or 2 days every year where we're really focusing narrowly in on specific aspects of privacy research. So, what direction is it going in the next 10 years? What's the relationship between networked privacy and ethics? How do you measure privacy when you're doing research? That's some of the examples that we have done with this group. So in terms of lessons learned, one of the challenges that we have had with some of these groups is around making sure that you have clearly articulated goals and mission statement. I'm a little jealous, Leslie, of those 6 goals that you say you came up with in 2012 and still hold today. This is something that, for example, with CASCI, which is something where I'm doing this, I'm the director, I'm doing this all in my own free time. I have very limited resources to spend in thinking about how to grow CASCI. Whenever I do, I say, yeah, there's all these things I would love to do if I had the time. But, we have this very generic mission statement of what our goals are, and to me that detracts from our ability to grow, because we haven't kind of carved out the specific things that we want to accomplish. Right now we're kind of in this stasis where we provide a time and a space to bring people together to talk, and I'm not going to lie, that's a great thing to do, but if we wanted to grow, if we wanted to expand beyond campus, if we wanted to have more of an impact, I think one of the very first things we would need to do is revisit this and figure out what contribution can we be making, do we want to make, what do we need to make those contributions. And maybe when I'm back from sabbatical next year, I'll take that on. But again, when you're an academic and you're not necessarily getting credit for these things, it really has to be a labor of love. It often has to take the back seat, and that's a challenge in academia in general. So a second lesson that I have found is that it's one thing to start building a network and have a bunch of buy-in in the beginning, but if you want those people to keep coming back, if you want them to keep contributing, if you want that network to grow, you need to have some kind of value add for the folks who belong in it. So to give you an example with this networked privacy group, one of the value adds is this community and this sense of community for folks who come to these workshops every year. But there's not much to be offered other than this information sharing. So we have a listserv, we have a Facebook page where people can share information, very low cost. It's not something that they're putting on their CV. So I'm always also thinking about, well, what can we do to provide more value to these people beyond informational value? When we think about what could constitute value, one of them is prestige, and I would say prestige is something with the HCIL that is a big value add to it. HCIL is really interesting, and we have debates about this every few years about the structure of it, because there's the HCIL, but then most faculty in the HCIL have their own labs. And so we're all umbrellaed under the HCIL, but we're all doing different research. And so we're thinking of like, how do we want to try to connect all of these different labs in more meaningful ways? Or is it enough that we just have the HIL as a venue in which we're sharing our own research? And we've never really been able to come to a conclusion as to whether some better way of doing this that makes our different research more interconnected. But there is a lot of prestige with being in the oldest HCI lab in the country, and that brings us money, that brings us attention, that brings us students, all those kinds of things. Informational opportunities like updates, funding, those types of things could be a value add. Again, that's kind of low. The networking or forming friendships or identifying collaborators, I think, is a big value add, especially if there aren't people in your own department, in your own area who are doing research. So a lot of the folks that I collaborate with don't have natural collaborators in their home department. And so these types of spaces and venues provide a really good opportunity for doing that. As Leslie said, again, I was a communication undergrad, so I know all about, the importance of communication and face-to-face communication. With Pervade, for example, we're at 7 different locations. We try to meet up twice a year in person for some sort of 2-day event. Oftentimes one of those is at a conference, and then one of them might be in one of the collaborators' home spaces. And we get so much done in these 2 days, but we're also really forging those relationships with our collaborators. And when you like somebody, it's much easier to work with them. When you know somebody, it's much easier to work with them in general. So doing that type of collaboration, that type of face-to-face interaction is going to really bring cohesion. This picture on the right for you is from the HCIL. Every year we go to Hci, Computer Human Interaction Conference, which is, 4,000 person conference. And every year they do this big picture. They ask folks to wear green shirts. They ask alumni to come. And so literally just taking the 10 minutes to do this group photo makes people feel like they are a member of that group. And I think it keeps that connection going. Another lesson, and I'm not sure if this is the last one, I think I have one more after this. Interdisciplinary problems require interdisciplinary solutions. This is obvious, but again, something that I assume is going to happen that maybe in your own research in your own spaces is not a guarantee, is that the research I'm doing is not specific to a discipline, and the research groups that I'm in, the centers that I'm in, the collaborations I do, by nature, have to be interdisciplinary. They would not succeed. I do think one of the big reasons that the NSF funded us with this Pervade large grant was that the 7 of us are very interdisciplinary. This idea of data ethics and the challenges around data ethics in the modern age is one that requires lots of different approaches to the problem. And so by bringing these people together, we were able to do it. This is an example of some of the different folks represented in the HCIL. And then finally, I want to say finally, let's see. Nope, second to finally. International collaborations are really challenging. I have not been involved in an international network, but I have been involved in international collaborations. And there are just lots of things that you need to think of. So I do privacy research. If you're not familiar with it, Europe has a very different attitude toward consumer privacy than the US. And so navigating that is an interesting research question in and of itself. But when you're trying to figure out literally just things like, where can we put the files? Can we put them on Dropbox? oh, EU won't let that us share that kind of data, like simple logistics like that. Just how you get incentivized, and I mean that in terms of like the researchers. If you're on the tenure track or the equivalent, like what do you need to do to get promoted, and does that match up? Language barriers, obviously. Different challenges, different policies. For us, the policy differences has been both fascinating and difficult. It's also really hard to coordinate funding across two different countries. So with the grant that I'm referring to, it was a collaboration between the NSF and the NVO, which is the equivalent of the NSF in the Netherlands, and they both reviewed it and they both gave us grants. The thing that is unfortunate is that they were 2-year grants on the US side, they were 4-year grants on the Netherlands side, and now that we're done that, there's no mechanism for us to easily put in to continue that research together. So we need to submit separately and hope that we both get funded and then figure out ways to match up again. So that opportunity was amazing. The sustainability problem of guaranteeing funding or providing funding across multiple countries is really hard. And then finally, again, also obvious, so I'll end here with just having a project manager, somebody whose primary job is to be making sure everything is running right. In academia, especially, is the only way that things are going to work. On the Pervade grant, we're very happy to have a full-time project manager, and I don't think we would be getting half of what we were getting done if we didn't have her. Yes, it's just you need to have somebody who that's their primary responsibility. Like Leslie said, if people are doing something and they're busy with lots of other things, things are going to slip through, things aren't going to work. And so making sure you're budgeting for that. And I know in the ExcelNet proposals, that is a big part of it, is funding for this type of thing. So yes, that should be taken as a given already. But just from my own personal experience, you'll either fail or you'll be at a glacial pace if you don't have people who are being paid to be doing just that. So I will end there. Thank you.
So now we can open the floor to questions. I think we have the mic over here.
So this is one of those, it's not really a question statements. I just really want to continue to sing the praises of having project management. I'm on the NIH side of life, and certainly it's much more accepted in that culture that now when we are reviewing proposals, if people don't actually explicitly list project management for the larger scoped proposals, that will very negatively impact our view of the project. So it's refreshing to hear that in other domains it's important, and I think NIH might really serve as a pretty good model for recognizing the importance of that. With the other thing, another dimension of that that's happening with one project that I'm involved with, it's a multi-PI consortium. Every one of those PIs has somebody who is designated as a project manager. And NIH, the funding office that we have many interactions with, they also are recognizing that they need project management. And what happens is that this information kind of percolates up, where you could have essentially several different scrums that are doing different types of development, and you're passing that information up to them, and then you're passing it to the funding agent. And for us, what's absolutely essential about that is on the NIH side, there's a whole bunch of policy development that we're highly dependent on that as an academic I have no control over. And so I can contact I'm on a daily communication basis on Slack with the project manager at the NIH side, and her official job is to be receiving when I highlight that there's a really big risk to the project, and then she really tracks down trying to do something with respect to the administrative development that needs to be accompanied with it. So that was not a question. I apologize, but does that resonate for you?
say you're applying for an NSF small, that's $500,000. Your university is taking over half of that. So basically you have enough money for a student and some of the research costs and maybe a month of summer salary. And people might say, well, my student can be that. The student should never be the project manager. I mean, they're there to be trained as research, not project management. And they're not going to come with those skills, and then you're just going to, I feel like it's going to create more work. So like people, I feel the pinch, especially in the smaller NSF grants, that there's just no way we could do it. But yeah, it never works out. So like I never even ask the students, then I'm the one who just has to do all of that because I don't want them to be doing all of the IRB requests and money processing and stuff like that. But yeah, and the only reason we made it a priority in this, recognizing it was big, and we had $3 million to work with, which doesn't happen too often.
I want to echo some of the things you were saying, and repeat something I had said earlier, which is that I feel like in my field, there is this real pushback against building money in for, administrative tasks that I'm usually the person who's arguing, no, we should all give summer salary to ourselves because we've got to honor what we're doing. And, I can't tell you how many times when I've talked to people about, oh, I'm struggling with this and struggling with that, they always say, well, why don't you get your grad students or postdocs to do that? And I don't have the energy to even explain to you why that is such a bad idea.
Either that or like all PhD students need to take like a web design course because they're all building our websites.
Yeah.
We're asking them all to do that.
And so it's hard because, again, there's not a lot of respect, I think, built in for just sheer administrative work of keeping these networks together.
I would like to ask you to comment on what I see as a paradox. So you mentioned that since this is happening on the margins of people's time, and so one has to be forgiven in terms of deliverables, right? If somebody missed a deadline or something like that. But earlier on, we heard that accountability, it's important. And ideally, you have to, schedule when things have to happen and who has to take care of them. So how do you reconcile those two things?
I would say that you have to decide what your priorities are, and if you need deliverables to be delivered, then you need to give the person the resources to do that. And often that's what we don't have. And we're asking people to donate their time, basically, to a cause that they may believe in. But if they're donating their time and we're not actually offering them the resources of our network, if they don't deliver, then you have to accept that. And if you want them to deliver, you have to make sure you're providing the resources. And so I would say you have to be forgiving to other people and also to yourself. Like, I feel a tremendous amount of guilt for the things that I've said I'm going to do and end up not getting to. But it's true that some things you need to accomplish. Make sure you have the resources to do it.
So I'd like to share the project manager, project director. I mean, we have a full-time project director, we have a full-time project manager, and I have the same guilt because we don't feel like we get it all done either, and we sort of pretty much manage as a partnership. So we've got separate things, we've got things that we decide together, and we talk every single day, multiple times on the phone. Our project manager's in California, I'm in Florida, and I have found that the National Science Foundation is really oriented toward project managers to make sure these projects run smoothly. And a number of our major networks who have joined through ADBC funding into what we do, the first networks, it was like, we can handle this. This can't be too hard. The later networks are now saying, no, we've got to have a project manager. And the folks early in the process of funding are telling the later ones in the process of funding, first thing you need to do is put in a project manager because this is way bigger than you can possibly imagine.
I'm also going to say that, so I'm working on two big collaborative projects right now, and one of them we put a ton of thought into our project management plan, and the other one I would say not so much. And we don't have an official project manager, but for that one group where we really put a lot of thought into that project management plan, we constantly go back to that project management plan. And when we're like, we're not sure what to do next, we're like, hey, let's go look at our project management plan. Even though we wrote it 4 years ago, it still has been a valuable tool for us to move our project forward.
Project managers, they can write those plans. I mean, they have the technical expertise, if they're certified, to actually deal with stuff NSF might have, like a project execution plan, whatever that is. I turn that over to our project manager because he's certified, he knows what he's talking about. And we can write good plans like that.
My question's to create a false dichotomy. So if your dean or department head came and said, you can have more money or more time, for you, which would you take?
For me, it's such a cop-out to say both, but I have to say, for me, if I have money, I have a great team that is really, really research productive, and if all I'm doing is facilitating their research, I feel like I'm getting a lot done. So I'll take the money and make the time, as long as I can use it for my research team.
I was going to say time, but yeah, money can buy you time.
Yeah.
So definitely money. Yeah.
I wonder if each of you could just talk briefly about, for one of your networks, the very beginning stages. And I understand how you can reach out to people you already know, but to pull in a broader community, how did you do that?
So I wasn't around for the beginning of several of them. So I guess I would have to go to the Privacy Researcher Network. And we had run the workshop a couple times, a couple different years, and we're like, well, there's actually a lot of folks interested in this who aren't getting to participate in every workshop. They're not seeing or hearing everything that we're doing. And so we need to think about ways to both make the content that's being generated from these conversations more widely available, but provide more opportunities for all folks who are doing this kind of research to be a part of the conversation, to be able to provide feedback. I mean, we are a relatively small group. I mean, it's 80 to 100 people. But we're all kind of joined together by this, focal point on trying to understand the privacy issues that are driving us into the mid part of the 21st century. And so it was really just the kind of core group of us just having a lot of conversations about what are the best ways to make sure that everybody has a voice in these conversations, everybody has access to materials, and especially younger PhD students who might be thinking about this. How do we get them involved? How do we make them feel like their voices, their opinions matter? And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very slow moving process, again, because I get nothing from doing this other than the benefit of connecting people. It helps my career in no way to do this. And so, yes, it is very slow. But I do think that it has been useful. And maybe in another 5 to 10 years, we'll be more structured and better able to grow. But
So it started with a workshop?
So it was the way that workshops in my the conferences that I go to is usually folks. You have a organizing committee that's usually 5 to 8 people who propose the workshop, get that accepted, and then there's an open call for people to submit position papers. And so this had run, I believe, the first one I went to was the third time it had run, and by the fourth time it had run, we were like, okay, we're on to something here. Like, they keep accepting these workshops, so they must think it's important. People keep coming to these, both new and returning people, so there's still lots of people interested. Maybe we should think about ways to go expand beyond just having a workshop every year at one of the main conferences that folks who are in social computing, human-computer interaction, those types of spaces, information science are attending.
So one thing I would say is that if you are trying to build a true network of networks, then hopefully if you're the lead person, you're more working with the lead of each network, because it can be overwhelming working with a ton of people. Now, having said that, one thing I do is, I'm very much a people person. I am very cognizant of people's personalities, and I try not to get into collaborations with people who seem like they're not going to be good collaborators. Now, sometimes that's impossible, but for the most part, I have a network of people that I know who know me, and when they say, Leslie, you should work with this person, that is a great lead for me. Because it is the group of personalities that make it work out. But on the other hand, if it's really big, you can't control everybody. But when a group has a good leader, that makes a huge difference. So if there's one person who's kind of a pain in the neck to deal with, just make sure that's not the leader. So I think just really, thinking about the team and whether or not people work well together.
So as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm finding myself wondering, where are the common areas between the types of networks that you've outlined in your two talks and professional societies, which I feel like offer maybe a parallel structure. So how has your experience in your networks of networks met needs that professional societies don't already meet? And what opportunities for sort of leveraging these two types of parallel structures could you envision?
To me, they're so different. Like, the professional societies are, so big and sprawling, and they meet the needs of the research community, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm working directly with those people. Like, with all the networks of networks, we have much more specific shared goals, and trying to produce something, whether it's a paper or a website or whatever it is, that is an actual deliverable, something tangible that we all have some ownership in. And I know that's something that professional societies do, but it's much more tailored for, I guess, a very specific outcome.
So none of mine are networks of networks, just to be clear. They're networks or groups or, other things, but none of the things that I'm involved in are networks of networks. I think Leslie has some very clear examples of that. I would say one of the biggest things that I have noticed is that participation in these different types of groups has given us new opportunities to push for issues that are important to us. So within the ACM community, Association of Computing Machinery, and specifically SIG-Chi, which is where the I don't know if I mentioned both, but anyway, two of the major conferences in social computing are based out of. At around the same time that this Pervade project was really getting underway, we saw two of our PIs who were part of a new unit specifically focused on ethics in big data type research. And so in our community, lots of people are scraping websites, lots of people are, doing all kinds of things that are in the ethically gray area. And so folks who are on this Pervade grant were able to have a big contribution to how that committee was set up in the larger ACM community and the types of directions that they're going. We've also been running town halls at a lot of these conferences every year to have conversations about ethics and research. It's a very hot topic, and it's very heated in our communities. People, again, a lot of this goes back to what discipline you're coming from, and not to stereotype, but a lot of times you'll see computer scientists who are just trying to build the best system, and so they're not necessarily recognizing that humans are on the ends of those data points, and the social scientists, meanwhile, are like, no, you need to think about consent and harm and all these other things. They are real people. So, we can have some really great debates, which is what we want. We want to have those conversations with the wider community, but just the grant and some of the attention around the grant and our ability to kind of take that and convert it into these larger discussions in the research community, I think has been really beneficial.
One thing really quickly, I was talking with someone about this earlier is, I love going to the annual conferences of, the professional societies I'm in, but my time is limited, and I've just found over the past few years that I don't want to travel so much, and I find myself more going to collaborative meetings because those face-to-face meetings are so important rather than going to the annual conferences, even though I get something entirely different and important out of those annual conferences. And at this point, I'm sort of glad I have a lab where I'm like, my postdocs and grad students are going to those conferences, because I just feel like I need to be at the PI meetings and I can't be traveling all the time.
So I don't have a question, but just an observation. And Jessica, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I was an early member of a mid-level member of HCIL. And what I found was so valuable about that experience is in establishing a culture. And so I will also say that I did end up collaborating with at least 3 of the different faculty members on different projects, and that culture setting was critical. So one of the first things that happened when I first joined the lab was a student from some other research project came in and showed up at one of our project meetings and sat down and said, I'm really interested in what you all are doing. Can I sit in and learn about what you're doing? And I think because HCIL is inherently interdisciplinary and there is this culture of openness and sharing, at least of information, it basically set the rules in such a way that interdisciplinary work was much more possible, and also team projects, team science was more possible. And so as members of HCIL now have gone out into the world, I imagine that if the research were to be done, that they are all much more team-oriented and collaborative than your typical effort like that.
There are a couple of things I didn't talk about with HCIL. One thing we do at the start of every semester is we have on our first day kind of like an introduction sharing session where everybody, and it's a lot more students and faculty, go around and just say what their research interests are. And a part of that is literally to help identify, who's doing what research, and, that you can go talk to that person if you're interested in that. Another thing we do every year is we have an annual symposium in which we're spending a day showcasing all of the work that's been happening in the HCIL, and it's open to the public, and we usually have about 300 attendees, but it's also great for people in the HCIL to be learning about the research that everybody else is doing. I will say that we tend to, one of the main missions is literally sharing and promoting what folks are doing. So there's never this research is more important or inherently better than other research. And just one example of HCIL facilitated collaboration for myself is through the lab and through Kids Team, I am working with another faculty member from education originally and a computer scientist we had Google funding, and now we just put in an NSF proposal to look at how to build privacy and security education into elementary school curriculum. And, just the 3 of us might never have talked, otherwise. But through the lab and through, these conversations and other types of activities, we were like, oh, yeah, we could put something together that satisfies all 3 of the types of questions we're asking. Great.
come up. If we get live stream questions, they're going to come on the screen. Rebecca will send them out to you. Speakers are coming up. Yeah, sorry.
Which is on defining a collective mission and vision. We have two distinguished speakers, and I will introduce them one at a time right before they speak. The first will be Guy Latreciano, and I hope I didn't butcher that too badly, who I know fairly well, and we're pleased to have you here. He's Associate Dean and Innovative and Collaborative Pedagogy, and Associate Professor of Clinical Research and Leadership at George Washington University. Guy is an expert in team science and collaborations. A lot of his work has addressed the need to develop skills and attitudes in knowledge-producing teams that have led to innovation and truly cross-disciplinary outcomes. So his interests include things like education, cross-disciplinary education and theory, applied complexity science principles and their use in team development. And if you missed it earlier, he's also president-elect of the International Network for the Science of Team Science. Or perhaps you are already president. Okay, he is president now. So with that, Guy, you may sit here or go up to the podium, your preference.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I just learned that all my slides, even the ones I originally hid, are showing up, so I may shoot through a couple of them. I want to thank Margaret and the team for inviting me here. I thought it'd be a great idea if we spent 3 hours working on a mission statement, because I know everyone loves to do that, and it's very productive use of time. I'm kidding with you. I know that's the last thing I hope you expected me to do. We are not going to create a mission statement, but rather talk about the mission of what it means to embrace some of the themes we've been talking about today. I was saying to Carrie in her office, that rich conversation we had when we first started is usually the type of conversation you have at the end of a workshop. So we really started off great. I thought these folks really get it. So it gave a great place to start and to move forward. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 20 minutes is to introduce a pipeline concept of team science, and you'll see what I mean in a minute by that. Explore some of the ways team science is working to inform scientific teaming. I also wanted to highlight resources that when you get the soft copy of the slides, you can go and, pull. It's always, I think, important when we do any sort of workshop that you get to have, party favors to take home with you. And I try to include as many as possible that I know you can access either virtually or otherwise. And all this I'm going to try to do in 20 minutes. So I looked up what the mission was of ExcelNet, and something that really grabbed my attention was where it says it's a program to accelerate the process of scientific discovery and prepare the next generation of U.S. researchers for multi-team international collaborations. I think that's an important part of this mission that we cannot lose sight of. It's not just to make our work more, or the work you're involved with, accelerate, but rather to change almost paradigmatically the way that we go about science, so that while we're doing science, we're creating a new generation of scientists that can learn from the way we're doing it. So something to consider is you'll hear the term the science of team science a lot. And that's really just a fancy term for those of us who study teams and try to learn through evidence-based research what teams do, how they work effectively, how they work ineffectively sometimes. But something we tend to forget is what is the role of the scientist in those situations. So I just wanted to draw attention to the differences here in this terminology. So the science of teams is really trying to understand how, through transcending any one disciplinary perspective or epistemological perspective, and what the application of new methodologic or conceptual frameworks are when teams work together, the study of that. But we also have to consider the role of scientists. And really, scientists and teams change their identity and how they view themselves. They have to. Otherwise, the first doesn't work at all. Otherwise, we're just sort of giving lip service to it. And that always is the thing. I think scientists always get a little weird when I bring that up. It's like, what do you mean I have to change my identity? Well, we are all highly identified by the way we've been trained. In fact, it's almost impossible for some of us to disconnect from the epistemological or methodological approaches that we've taken, and we received that indoctrination through our traditional training. It's almost impossible to completely separate ourselves from it. But if we have this expectation that we can change, and probably should change, once we start to interface with other people, especially in teams that are trying to produce knowledge, it really changes up why we even do team science in the first place. It's so that we are entering into a change environment that is going to affect us, it's going to affect our ability and the effectiveness of the team to actually do or possibly solve the problems that the research requires. Before we go too far, in your folders, there's a one-pager. It's back and forth, like this, front and back. And I want to draw your attention to it. This is something you can take home and try. I use this activity with folks that are trying to oftentimes trying to start out somewhere. Where do we start? How do we all sort of get on the same page? And this is an activity that tries to develop trust, a very important dynamic in forging new teams and to sustain new teams. As they start to figure out what is it that we find is important about what we're about to do. So the concepts here, and we're not going to do this. This is for you to take home and maybe try it out if you'd like. But I think it illustrates some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about. So this idea of looking to the future, why are we coming together? It's to reach some sort of future state of a situation. Otherwise, we would simply go the path we've been going. Oftentimes, don't forget, scientific teams are forged to accomplish something that we know is unaccomplishable as an individual, right? As an individual researcher. So this is an opportunity to get the whole system in the room. We're talking about networks and networks of networks, and sometimes getting them all physically in the same room. Think of it metaphorically, getting everyone on the same page or in the same room. Exploring all aspects of the system before trying to fix any one part. Before we get into arguments over, you should do it our way, or you should do it their way, or just sit down and try to paint a picture of the landscape that you're trying to get your head around in your scientific team with the stakeholders that you're trying to engage with. Put common ground and future actions front and center. Treating problems and conflicts as information, not action items. So basically, don't fix. Just try to get a hold of what's going on and how you might just sort of deal with it, not fix it. Because some things you want to fix sometimes shouldn't have been fixed in the first place. Okay? And this, especially if those of you who think conflict is something that you should flatten all the time, sometimes the best conflicts yield the best results. So be careful not to create in your mind a utopia of what teaming should be before you take the time to think about what is it that we have in front of us? Because it might be golden, and by the time you're done, it's going to be bronze. So be careful there. Have people accept responsibility for their own work, conclusions, and action plans. So basically, this is not a homework assignment. You could take it home and peruse it. It's an opportunity to explore what a collective mental model of the team could be using individual perspective to build it. Now, unlike doing a mission statement up on whiteboards, we've all been there, right? And like it or not, we've been there, trying to construct just the right combination of words to capture, everything that the entire team might be feeling at that particular time. We sometimes forget that individuals and teams of teams are not all in the same place at the same time. So no one episodic point in time is going to capture any of it. In fact, mission statements are often those things where we look back and say, ooh, we wrote that 5 years ago. Let's just take that off the website now and rethink it, okay? So as you take a look at this sort of activity, and it's just an example, this is something you can do very simply with your team and I think it's particularly important when you're talking about large, expansive teams, to truly try to understand what are the dynamics. Before we try to construct the perfect house, what materials are we working with? And this is just an example. But I thought it was a good sort of segue. I was going to do this at the end of the presentation to the presenters prior, because I thought this might be something to think about as we move forward. So, team science, and I always laugh, and Margaret is right, we know each other pretty well, where she said, Guy might get a little twinge in his eye when I say this. Part of the challenge in team science is understanding that it's really an interdiscipline. And it is inherently a discipline that's evolving from a multiplicity of disciplines, all with their own favorite epistemological approaches, et cetera, et cetera. So often I know in teaching doctoral students, for instance, they come back and said, I did the search, but I didn't find anything. It's like, well, how many databases did you try it out on? And being in health and medicine, they say, oh, PubMed. It's like, well, guess what? All of knowledge is not on PubMed. So you have to understand that inherent into the study of team science is the fact that we are interdisciplinarians. Some of us very embedded in our disciplines, other of us trying to bridge the gaps across disciplines. Oh, and I wanted to draw your attention, if you have particular interest, you can go to a Mendeley site that is managed by the team science community. This is very organic. Some of you may be familiar with it, where we try to bring together our literature that comes from everywhere. And it actually, I found, has been very helpful to people who have trouble sort of navigating the breadth of our literature. So here are some definitions that I think are helpful. I mentioned them before. What is team science? It's research conducted by more than one individual in an interdependent fashion. That is not having a staff that works for you. That is being part of a team that is in a reciprocal relationship. The science of team science, as I explained, is the study of teams, the empirical study of teams. If you're interested in a free, your tax dollars are at work, report on this, I highly recommend Cook and Hilton, which is enhancing the effectiveness of teen science, which was the result of a workshop over the course of a year and a half, where this is basically sort of the state of the field at this particular time when it was published in 2005. So when I look at the NSF's big 10 ideas, right? I can't think of any one of these that wouldn't require some sort of shift in the way that we've done traditional science over the years. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of these, but if I look at any particular one that I focus on in my own teaching with my doctoral students is this idea of convergence research. And it really changes the way that they have been taught to do science up to that point in their career. So, I mean, any one of these, when I go deep into them, I think these are really paradigmatic changes. They're revolutionary shifts in the way that we do science, and you know that. I'm not going to get into this, but this is one of my slides that I wasn't going to show, but we often talk about the concept of knowledge-producing teams, which are different Then other types of teams are task-oriented in my own area. It's the difference between research teams and, like, for instance, healthcare teams. I think someone else Margaret brought up surgical teams. Surgical teams don't walk in saying, let's social dynamic our way through this. No, that's not what they do. They have a very strict set of protocols, and many other teams do. I'm sure you'd be happy to know that your pilots have protocols that they follow. They're not just saying, oh, let's try it this way this time, So research teams, knowledge-producing teams are quite a different bird, and we oftentimes focus specifically on the differences between the activity of producing knowledge, or having the goal of producing knowledge, and rather doing other types of teaming. We sometimes forget there's major differences there. Lately, I've been thinking about, when we talk about a lot of the themes that have come up already today, about how they fit in a pipeline. Now, this is the mission part of the talk here. So imagine, for instance, if we were trying to encapsulize all these points we're bringing up about the way we train students, the way we promote people, the problems with funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lately, I've been trying to figure out how this contributes to the life cycle of what it means to be a team scientist, okay? And you're going to learn quite quickly that we don't exactly perpetuate team scientists very well along the life cycle, but I just want to draw attention to what some of these dynamics are. So many of you, and I don't know everyone's projects, many of you are going to be interfacing with students who are learning. You're also going to be dealing with either juniors, in whatever case, doesn't have to be academic, that are trying to establish themselves. Maybe you're trying to establish yourself. Making a point for why team science should be an institutional priority in whatever way. Sustaining collaborations, we just talked about that. What happens when you're on two different funding cycles? How do you sustain the work? And then, mentoring scientists to be team members. And that conundrum within itself. Senior scientists want their junior people to succeed. Well, are we telling them this is the way to get the brass, ring, or this is the way I really want to see you work throughout the rest of your career? Those are two different messages. So let's talk about this life cycle a little bit. First is the idea of developmental training. Training new scientists. How are we training new scientists? These are the objectives, of course. Engaging, rewarding, and assessing teams in the learning environment. Team development amidst individual development. This is all part of the learning process of becoming a team scientist. The challenges, of course, are how do we measure team engagement, engagement and effectiveness. This has come up, right? What are the objectives around teaming and the set of core skills needed? Do you have clearly in your mind what are the teaming skills that you and your team actually should be embracing and exercising and sharpening up at all times so that you can be a scientific team? And then, of course, the measurement along with the individual and also the team level measurement that's going to lead to giving you some insight into if you're in fact meeting the mark. Here's an example. I'm going to let you read this later just in case I run out of time. But here is an assessment. There are assessments available. I can provide more of these to put into your package that can be used in your team to assess effectiveness in very many different ways. Here are some projects to follow. Again, you're going to have this in soft copy. The Center for Leading Innovation Collaboration that's funded by NCATS at NIH, SESYNC, of course, the Team Science Education and Training Facebook, believe it or not, there's a Facebook for that, and special interest groups in Insights, which includes team science training. Okay, this is all part of that first phase. And these are resources that you can access and use. In the professionalizing team phase, we're trying to establish professions in professions. So there's those of us who study team science, and that's our job, and we were hired for it, and so goes it. Then there's those of us who studied epidemiology, anything else, biotechnology, whatever, and now they're going into professions. In those professions, are you going to be rewarded for being a team scientist in that profession or in that discipline, okay? So part of the objective here is professionalizing teams so that people can actually go into environments where they actually are paid to be team scientists and not simply one-offs, okay? The challenges, of course, are to focus on practical problems, not just theoretical ones that are science for science sake, and the lack of incentives and reward systems for those types of people. I don't need to go into the details of the horror stories of people that were the best collaborators you ever worked with, but somehow they didn't get tenure. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. Can we create a pipeline of professionalism that allows people who are professional collaborators to compete and to succeed in a pipeline instead of having to be an individualized sort of researcher? There is an article that has been published last year by Julie Thompson-Klein and Holly Falk-Kaczynski that talks about this exactly, and more specifically in the context of academia and how our reward systems are problematic for people to actually excel in team science, and I invite you to read that. You can look that up later. There are also some other examples here. I want to draw your attention to the fact there are some associations and universities that are going out of their way to make sure that criteria change so that team scientists can actually be rewarded and succeed in their fields. Institutionalizing team science is really getting to a point where we start to normalize that that is the type of science we want to do in the institutions which we live in. We've talked about some of these issues already. And the challenges, of course, are funding streams that reward science conducted in teams. That's come up already, right? And developing metrics for evaluation that evaluate teams. This is a good example. I wasn't going to show you this. NSF, the ERC program model. Some of you may be familiar with this. That's a really good example. I was educated when I became a reviewer and realized that there was a lot of weight put into that collaborative plan against the scientific ideas and resources that you can look up. Sustaining that collaboration, which we aspire to and is part of our mission, is equally important as Jessica brought up, but embracing the values of team science, being sensitized to team readiness, and measuring organizational readiness so that we can sustain those things. And the challenges are, of course, measurement and evidence, which is always a problem, and scholarly and practical materials necessary, and more resources there. And lastly, mentoring team members. I think this is really one of the most important phases here, because how many people here, you don't have to raise your hand, have in the course of mentoring said, well, this is how I learned it. We've all done it, and it's natural. We go back to our own experience. But in the team science pipeline, some of us have to start to think, okay, how do I need to mentor younger folks, junior faculty, the generation behind me, whatever, so that they are supported and they are shaped so that they become team science naturalists and not something that they sort of come out of their developmental training and have to sort of rethink everything they were taught. I'm going to stop there. I wasn't going to show you the slide, so I'll just go backwards. I'm going to stop there because I'm out of time, but we'll have time in questions to talk about some of these. Thank you.
Guy.
Thank you.
Yes, we'll have plenty of time and discussions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Roberto Delgado. He's Program Director of the Arctic Observing Network at NSF's Office of Polar Programs, and he's pivotal to helping manage NSF's Navigating the New Arctic Big Idea. He co-leads the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee's IARPC, that's one more acronym, Environmental Intelligence Collaborative Team. That's a mouthful. He represents the U.S. in the Circumpolar and International Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks. And prior to being at NSF, he was a program chief at the NIH. And he previously held research faculty positions at Hunter College of the University of New York and the University of California. So welcome.
So it's a little bit of a lag. All right, there we go. Thank you, Margaret, for the introduction. Just quick correction, University of Southern California. You said University of California. Big rivalry there, right? So anyway, Trojans, not Bruins or Bears or anteaters or banana slugs. So I appreciate participants in person, online viewers, as well as the organizing committee, my colleague Claire as well for helping support this workshop. I'm going to take a little bit different tack than what you've heard thus far today and really sort of home in on a case study, specifically with the Arctic observing networks that I'm involved in at different scales. And try to share with you some best practices, some lessons learned, a lot of which will reinforce what we've already heard about collaborations and leadership and management, et cetera. And so hopefully this will just be an example that reaffirms some of the approaches and techniques that we've been learning about or refreshing ourselves about today. So let me give you a little bit more context as well in terms of how I fit in or my program and where I'm going to take you for the next 15 minutes or so. So as Margaret said, I am a program director in the Office of Polar Programs, National Science Foundation. I manage the Arctic Observing Network, which is one of 4 science programs in the section for Arctic Sciences. Some of you may be familiar with the section for Antarctic Sciences as well. That's the other side of the house. The other 3 science programs includes natural sciences, social sciences, and system sciences. However, the Observing Network is a little bit different in that I'm allowed to fund projects for 5 years instead of 3 years and really focus on several different, what I like to consider pillars. These include instrumentation and deployment of new observing systems, as well as the development of observing networks, both domestically and internationally, as well as efforts to support data access and management. And the slide just shows you sort of the brief overview of what NSF AON granting program oversees. Now, as an example, I have a wide portfolio that encompasses atmospheric sciences, terrestrial science, sea ice, permafrost, as well as community observing. And together, this broad, diverse portfolio forms its own network. So hence the AON title here. And so this is an example. There's an Arctic Great Rivers Observatory. There's local observations. There's International Tundra Experiment. There's a Greenland Ice Sheet Monitoring Network as well. So you can see a very diverse group of interdisciplinary scientists. We're talking glaciologists and oceanographers, terrestrial ecologists, social scientists, who are all part of this single Arctic Observing Network portfolio. So that's one level. Now, if you take it a step up and remember this IARPC, Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee that Margaret mentioned that I serve on as a co-lead for a collaboration team on environmental intelligence, we also have the Interagency Domestic Network. And this requires me to coordinate and communicate with other federal agencies like NASA, like NOAA, like the Department of Energy, on similar types of programs where they are engaged in different forms of Arctic observing. So as an example, the Department of Energy has their next generation of ecosystem experiments, or ENGIE. They have an Arctic program that is largely focused on permafrost. NASA has several different campaigns from their cryospheric sciences and also their Earth observation programs, including IceBridge, ISAT. These are all acronyms some you may or may not be familiar with, but basically focusing on overflights or satellite imaging to basically monitor and observe changes in ice composition and coverage over the Arctic and Antarctic in some cases. There's also an Arctic boreal vulnerability experiment that overlaps with Arctic observing. And NOAA has, of course, their 6 line offices, including their Office of Oceanic and Arctic Atmospheric Research, the National Marine Fisheries, Ocean Sciences, National Weather Service, and many of the scientists and researchers who are supported through those agencies also overlap with my portfolio. And so it really behooves us to be coordinating through the interagency on the types of different systems that are being observed and monitored over the course of our support. So that brings me to the national level. But then furthermore, what I really want to focus on in the remaining time is the international, the circumpolar Arctic, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, which is a joint effort that originally was started through the Arctic Council, which is a small intergovernmental organization that focuses on sustainable development and environmental conservation, as well as the International Arctic Science Committee. And the bullets here show you what the overall mission and vision of SESYNC is. And I'll begin telling you a little bit more about the goals and how the mechanics work with respect to some of the concepts and ideas we've heard earlier in the day. So to start off, just remind you of what the goals are of the SESYNC. I'll be using the acronym SESYNC, representing Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks. And they are to create a roadmap to a well-integrated Arctic observing system. And well-integrated takes on different definitions depending on who you talk to. But what is also really key and consistent with the US AON network, as well as the NSF AON program that I direct, promoting free and ethically open access to observational data, as well as ensuring sustainability, which we've been hearing a lot about today. And that third goal, as we'll come to know or come to learn, is one of the more challenging ones to really implement. So I want to borrow a little bit from Guy's presentation. He showed us sort of the developmental stages of team science and team science approaches. And within the SESYNC initiative, there are two of those components that really resonate. One is the institutionalizing the team science aspect, where the research is driven by a specific and compelling challenge. And that is to, again, develop this sustained integrative Arctic observing framework internationally among nation states, permanent participants, or representatives of indigenous organizations across the Arctic, intergovernmental organizations, some nonprofits as appropriate, and other Arctic stakeholders. Second point from the institutionalizing the team science approach is that there is this deep integration of disciplines. As I sort of began my presentation just remarking on the diversity of my portfolio, again, you have different collective of scientists working together in a cooperative fashion to try to minimize the gaps in observational data across the Arctic in an effort to increase our scientific understanding, improve forecasting and global modeling efforts, as well as to make those data readily accessible. So that's really key. And I could have also mentioned there are other networks within NSF, for example, long-term ecological research programs, including one that I manage in the Arctic. There's also that's one of the main ones. And plus the Navigating the New Arctic, which Guy was kind enough to mention as well, and I helped manage that initiative. There are many new projects that are in the process of being awarded right now that really bring that convergence team science approach, integrating natural sciences, social sciences, and the built environment or the engineering aspect. But to get back to the SESYNC initiative, and another aspect that I drew from Guy's presentation is that of sustaining the collaboration, which I think we all learn, or many of us have learned through experience, can be really, really challenging. Working with international partners, language, cultural differences, not to mention time zones and trying to schedule joint calls. The members of SESYNC are global and span at least 10, not 12 time zones. And so some folks are still in their pajamas in the morning or getting ready to go to bed, but yet make the effort and have the enthusiasm to participate and engage actively. But a couple of the points that I took away from Guy's presentation was this idea of continuing and ongoing encouragement. There is a real strong incentive and motivation among the participants and members of the SEON initiative across the states, across the nation states, to really achieve the previously stated goals. And also the measurement and evidence, as Guy mentioned, was it remains a challenge because, again, you are looking at different types of data streams from atmospheric sciences, ocean sciences, terrestrial ecology, social science research, and someone at the end of the day has to find a way to integrate those different data to improve forecasting and global Earth models. And so let me dig a little bit deeper into the mechanics of SEON, its membership, its governance structure, and how we coordinate, communicate, and try to advance the goals. So Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, again, is broadly international. All interested parties are welcome through different national bodies, and we have partners from Europe and Asia, certainly North America. It includes all the 8 Arctic Council nations, as well as non-Arctic Council countries such as China, Germany, Italy, and the ones listed here. Indigenous organizations, as I mentioned, through the Arctic Council, they're referred to as permanent participants. The primary players in SEON include the Aleut International Association, Inuit Circumpolar Council, and Sami Council, as well as other intergovernmental partners, including the World Meteorological Organization. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a joint effort that was initiated through the Arctic Council alongside the International Arctic Science Committee, sort of this broad professional organization for Arctic science. Moving ahead and thinking about governance, given the extent, the broad participation or broad membership of this group, there's actually a very, very sort of formal governance structure that includes a board, an executive committee, a secretariat, which is where the leadership aspects come through, as well as the coordination and communication, making sure that we have scheduled calls well in advance, proposed agenda, the correct call-in information, et cetera. And then there are other sort of supporting aspects, including a recently stood up roadmap task force, which again puts us in line to a specific goal, and the other partners are also involved as appropriate. On the right-hand side, I note that while there is this broad board and exec committee for SEON, there are actually 2 committees that do a lot of the work, basically are essentially the working groups. And the way that this is formalized is through a lot of reference documents. And so I really liked how Margaret laid out some of the key features of successful or best practices in networks of networks, things like face-to-face communication, or face-to-face meetings rather, communication, the accountability, rules, and leadership. I didn't use them all, but those are things that really resonated with my experience in the SEON initiative. And so the new declaration was an Arctic Council ministerial document where it established the SEON initiative. Subsequent to that, there was a term of reference document for the board. Subsequent to that, with stakeholder input from the different partners and stakeholders, an implementation plan was developed, terms of reference for the committees, which I'll go into shortly. There was even an external review within the first 5 years to really sort of do a course adjustment, making assuring that the SEON initiative and the activities were on the right track. And so all of these documents are made readily accessible to the membership and to the public through an online portal, arcticobserving.org. One thing I forgot to put on these slides, but if you Google SEON, arcticobserving.org, you'll go to this nice portal website, which includes many of these reference documents about membership of the board, the partners. There are now, last time I checked, about 24 different international partners involved. And a lot of other reference supporting material there. In the last few years, there's been a little bit more effort towards moving from sort of the strategy from the strategy to an implementation. There was even a study produced by the Science and Technology Policy Institute, or STIPI, that arrived at an International Arctic Observations Assessment Framework, which has fed into a 10-year strategy for SEON, and then most recently a roadmap task force, which is sort of the detailed implementation plan for that strategy. So a lot of documents, a lot of references, but it sets the rules, right? We understand what we want to achieve, and we're beginning to figure out how to actually take the concrete steps to achieve those goals. So how does this work in practice? I'll return to those two committees I mentioned earlier. There's a committee on observations and networks, or CON. They have several sort of guiding parameters here: conducting an inventory of observational assets, improving the network, so recruiting additional partners that are appropriate and consistent with the goals and the vision of SEON, and again, sort of moving to the more challenging aspects, trying to maintain the sustainability, and I'll return to that towards the end. But ultimately, really working towards improving the planning for current and future observational systems. So that's the CON, the Observations and Networks Committee. With respect to the data, which is equally important in our minds, Arctic Data Committee has their own website as well, and they have very specific tasks that include mapping the Arctic data ecosystem, developing common metadata elements, data publication, citation, network building, of course. And they've also benefited from in-person meetings. There is an upcoming Polar Data Forum to be held in Finland in November this year. There's a website there with a little bit more information for anyone who has an interest in that aspect. But more broadly, even though we have these sort of subcommittees, well, not subcommittees, but committees as part of the SEON that are driving specific tasks, there's also an Arctic Observing Summit that is the annual gathering of stakeholders and partners and members where we come together in this high-level summit, providing an opportunity for interaction, the community-driven science-based guidance for the design, implementation, coordination, you can read as well as I can, in terms of the types of observation systems that need to be put in place and how we actually go about putting them into practice. And so what I want to conclude in with my last couple of minutes is sort of highlighting the opportunities and challenges of this type of effort. I think within the Arctic observing community, opportunities and benefits are relatively clear. That include enhancing scientific understanding of environmental change across the Arctic and its impacts on the global system, definitely increasing or having more effective and efficient use of data available, although some of the challenges with that, not explicitly labeled here, include differences in national policies for data access and management. We've heard a little bit about differences in national policies already. That certainly is consistent with our experience here as well. The other, and certainly improved opportunity, is maximize societal benefit of observation system investments. There's really been a push in recent years since the STIPI observation assessment framework to look at societal benefit areas and how observations can inform can help with decision support, with improving forecasting and modeling, so that there is these, what in NSF parlance would be considered broader impacts. The challenges, of course, I think won't be new to anyone. How do we identify and motivate different disparate Arctic observing communities to lead and manage networks? Touched upon briefly, working across nations, across time zone, across cultures and languages can be certainly challenging in that respect. And what is often needed in these types of efforts are champions who are really motivated, incentivized to take that leadership role and who have good managerial and time management skill sets to motivate others as well to achieve these goals. And goes without saying, how can we ensure the sustainability with respect to financing of the necessary long-term observations, especially in times of resource limitations and competing priorities. That can be many different things depending on your context and position. But one of the things being part of a funding agency is that if I receive the right proposals, we can make important contributions from the U.S. to the larger SEON initiative. And I'll add that this year there was a Horizons 2020 call for proposals that really was geared and aligned with many of the SEON vision and goals. So I think my time is up for now, and happy to take questions alongside Guy. Thank you for your time.
So I also want to remind participants that are watching remotely that you can submit questions and we'll make sure they get addressed. So I want to open it up for questions, but I want to broaden it as well. So we're talking about, missions and goals, but we can really address any topic we've covered today or that we've been discussing. And so ask your questions of these two, but also feel free to share your own experiences and ask questions of one another so we can get a discussion going again. So I open the floor. Back here.
So, Roberto, that was I think the most depth that we've gone into with respect to governance. So I have a question about that, and we were invited to talk about our own personal experience. So when I've been involved with large consortia with the NIH, virtually every person that's brought into the room is a PI that's received an award. And the idea is that we form some type of steering committee and we arrive at decisions by consensus. And the problem with that is that we, in general, use consensus style that's pretty much if one person objects, then we don't go in a certain direction. And it's not uncommon for somebody to push an agenda that is least disruptive to them, let's say. Or if there's sort of a technical implementation that's part of their research and they're wedded to, it's hard for them to sort of let go of that. So it seems like you have a dizzying level of governance structures, and how do you deal with it? It sounds like at some point there's so many people involved. There must be a point at which somebody has to be able to override somebody else. So what does that look like, or is it the same thing for you?
No, that's an excellent question. And so I didn't get into too much. I mean, I outlined the structure, but there is a chair and a vice chair. These are international individuals. The vice chair is from the United States. The chair is from Iceland, if I'm not mistaken, right now. These are rotating positions as well. But so when there is an issue of contention where there isn't consensus, initially there are we have monthly calls, for example, board meetings. Everyone weighs in. Well, the expectation is that everyone weighs in, but in reality, not everyone weighs in. There are different levels of engagement. Sometimes that depends. Sometimes some country representatives are consistently not engaged or more engaged. Again, depending on the particular issue. But ultimately, so there is an effort to have some discussion, weigh the pros and cons of the decision for the particular issue. But ultimately, if there isn't consensus, there often is at least a trend or a slight majority one direction, and then ultimately the chair and vice chair make the decision, the executive decision to participate, join a new collaboration or new activity, stand up a new roadmap task force, or participate in some type of activity. And so, there is an opportunity both for that sort of stakeholder engagement. A lot of time, well, in some cases, depending on the timing, there might be an opportunity to go do a listening session or some breakout at either the Arctic Observing Summit that happens biannually, or the other time is on an annual basis. The face-to-face meeting for the SEON board is during the Arctic Science Summit Week, and so that's an annual event that again allows the opportunity for folks to come together and maybe I don't want to say cut a side deal, but have those side conversations that aren't necessarily possible on your monthly go-to meeting, WebEx, Zoom, Blue Jeans, whatever platform you use. And so that's how oftentimes these decisions get made.
Hi, two comments and then a question. First comment is it would be really interesting to put up the budget alongside these conversations, because I'm contrasting the previous conversation where the discussion at the 500K level is probably slightly different than what you're talking about, Roberto, maybe by a factor of a couple of so it's just interesting that price points matter in terms of governance. The second observation is this is a really challenging one for me to get a grasp with, because the detailed case study of a large-scale activity and the small-scale overview of a pervasive activity are very hard to reconcile. So here's the question to try to reconcile that. Imagine that you had to take a bunch of stuff out, Roberto, to keep that thing running. If you had to take a whole bunch of stuff out, could you do that? Could you tell us what's the core of your governance structure? What do you need to do to keep it? And then, Kai, if you could say, what's the one thing that you'd want to add to make it work? Can you do that? And you do notice my questions are always in choice form. Sorry.
Oh my goodness, what to remove? Actually, I want to respond to the original comment about the financing, because that's the funny thing. There aren't dedicated funds to stay on, and so that was one constraint or critique from the review. The external review back in 2016 was that this is an unfunded mandate in large part, and so it's the will, the wherewithal of different national representation. They provide in-kind support on office or individual's time to be a chair or a vice chair or part of the executive committee. And even for me, this is not part of my terms of reference as an Aon program director for NSF. This is an extracurricular activity, but because of my position as Aon program director and part of the U.S. Federal Interagency Arctic Observing Network, this is recognized by my office as an important asset, but it's not in my job description. And so I have to take that into account, but that may change. And so it's similar for the other countries and for the other organizations that are involved here. So that's the challenge. Although we're trying to like I think Claire mentioned, trying to tackle these types of challenges. How can we make it a priority, which it should be in my mind, so that we have dedicated resources, both personnel and time, as well as finances to support some of these. But you're right. We are relying on funded projects through my program, through NASA projects, NOAA projects, DOE projects, international funding organizations. So that's one part. With respect to what I would take away, wow.
I was trying to make sure that you didn't feel like you had to remove it. I was like, what's the one thing you want to keep?
What would I want to keep?
The thing that you have to hang on to when everything else is going away. This is the group of people that I have, or this is the mechanism that I can't let go of.
The board. You need to have that board. That board is really representative of the stakeholders, because it's not just program officers or even PIs necessarily. You have advisors to ministries, people in those positions across the circumpolar Arctic.
I wonder if I can expand the question for you to talk more broadly about processes and very concrete examples of activities to arrive at a governance structure that suits people, and also to deal with issues so that there is some shared leadership, that it's not all on one person?
So I think this project, or this constellation of projects, is particularly unique in that it is a global wicked problem. It clearly isn't just about collaborating for the sake of bringing different people from different parts of the world. It's actually a problem that affects all of the world. So as I heard you explain that to me, it was interesting how even in those high-stake situations, there's still the socio-political aspect that enters, probably more so than ever, enter into it, that require that you eventually say somebody has to decide, instead of what is our collective agreement. And I think with so many things these days, and the reason why we have these big, complex, wicked problems is because we can't come to rational consensus on what is it that affects all of us and what is the work that we have to do that impacts all of us. And I think there is an opportunity to really spend some time, and I almost can't get my head around the complexity of this sort of project. but it's almost one of those that requires mental modeling. Not just imagining what Iceland gets out of it and what Sweden gets out of it and Greenland, and I apologize if I'm minimizing the complexity of the problem, but rather what is the global problem that we all need to come to agreement on. Not consensus, agreement, not hierarchical decision making. That is really team science on the macro level. We aren't just talking about a bunch of folks that are going to meet in the conference room and figure out what we believe in. This has much higher stakes, and I think the magnitude of the problem and the impact of projects like this are so high that you really do have to get back to those simple terms. What do we all agree we're here to do? And how do we intend to do it so that we all benefit from it, rather than who has the loudest voice in the room and who has most of the money? That's the way I can respond to that.
Questions? I want to also remind online folks that they can submit questions, and we do have one that came in now, and so I'll read that. My question is about international networks. At the high level that many networks exist, reaching the right people who are the ones doing the work is critical to accomplish AccelNet goals. How do you recommend ensuring that you are including researchers, not just the figureheads? We do plan to emphasize early career engagement. Any other ideas? Ask you to respond, and then I'd ask some people in the audience to please respond as well. Ensuring that you include researchers, not just the figureheads.
I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think that's as difficult as it may sound, at least from an NSF perspective. NSF is very good at outreach, in my opinion, very well connected to different research communities. A lot of what my office supports, what Claire's office supports, and other directors support, is driven by the researchers in large part. And so whenever there are new initiatives, like an AccelNet, like the big idea is navigating the new Arctic, there's often tremendous effort, outreach, and communication from the NSF, from the program officers, from the research community themselves to help spread the word and to bring in NNA, I think, navigating the New York, is a really great example. One of the aims was to promote a more inclusive, diverse research community, not just your long-time Arctic researchers, but bringing in folks from outside the Arctic who are social scientists or social science researchers and economists and historians and political scientists or geographers just doing migrations, et cetera. And so, unfortunately, in this past year, because of the partial lapse in appropriations, that was limited. But the expectation, this is a 5-year initiative, there will be an expected second solicitation call for proposals, and the idea is, again, to really recruit widely across different research communities, not just your traditional Arctic research.
Guy, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, when I read this question, I'm drawn to the idea of international networks, which are very different than, networks that occur within one country or jurisdiction, and also the idea of bringing in career people at different points in their careers. So, both of those remind me of how the reward systems are so different in different places in the world. How you get from this point of your career to the next point, not tenure, but just how you have a career, are different. And it's important that any team, no matter how large, reconcile how they are going to ensure that the rewards and the recognitions that is needed for the different team members is part of what is included in the collaboration plan. So that if you have early investigators, we'd like to be able to say it doesn't matter if you are part of a collaborative team, you'll do fine. And we know that doesn't always work out. They might need to publish and be the first author. Well, why don't we prioritize that for a particular person? Or if it's a different type of reward arrangement, just being sensitive that the diversity of teams includes the diversity of career pathways that are present in these different teams and their different disciplines, and especially in international environments where it's not just the American system, it might be the system of 10 different countries. People need to be able to have a pathway to advance in their career, and teams who recognize that tend to get the most out of the workforce because you're tapping into the motivations that are most important to them as to why they want to collaborate.
Yes, Claire.
Pick up on that point because it's really important that there are within different countries different cultures and different systems, and so the question about the bringing in the figurehead speaks to the fact that many other countries have much more hierarchical systems than we do, and there is an expectation that the most senior person is the person there. Even if they are a figurehead, they need to be there. And so it is an important question of respecting different countries' organizational structures for their research environments and ensuring that you're sensitive to that, but you also have all of the right people, not just the figurehead, but the real researchers who are going to carry out the work too. So great question, great points.
It's not unusual, very practically speaking, for a team that I'm on to sit down at the onset and say, okay, who's going to take the lead on this paper? And who is going to do what on this paper? And I produced 2 papers in a row one year where the we just had an arrangement. I'll take first authorship for this paper, you take first authorship on the second paper. And that may seem like so, basic, but it's really important to be sensitive to those realities, because otherwise you're not setting up an environment where people are going to want to collaborate over time. They're going to get burned and not want to collaborate again, or they're not going to find any reward in collaborating, and they're going to start to isolate.
So here's a follow-up question that came in online. This is from Nancy Grin. She said, "That's great, thanks. Good ideas about different reward systems in other countries. Also, this is relevant to the future Earth person's comments about developing countries." So thanks, Nancy, for that comment. I want to ask the group if we can get some examples of how to recruit those individuals who may become really valuable members of your network that you don't know. We worry about that constantly at SESYNC, that we all tend to reach out to the people we know, yet there may be other individuals out there who are very creative, could commit a lot of time that we don't know. So anyone want to tell us about how they brought in new people into a network that they did not know?
It's pretty obvious, and a lot of people do this, but we try and host symposia at various conferences, and that really broadens the appeal and the swath of people that you interact with. So the research coordination network that I am PI of is Genomes to Phenomes to Populations in a Changing World. So it's all of biology, right? Mm-hmm. And so we go to a number of different conferences in the year, and we try and host a symposium at each one of those. So we'll go to ESA, we'll go to APS, we'll go to SIGB, and we get new memberships on a regular, or new members on a regular basis that way.
We have run dozens and dozens and dozens of workshops through our project, and we are always on the lookout for people in those workshops that seem to be leaders in the community that we're serving. And we lean on those folks for planning future workshops and for coming in and being trainers for us when we're trying to do that. And sometimes when we're looking for people to hire, we go to some of those folks and say, why don't you put your name on the list? Because we want to hire them. And for us, it's really getting to know the community very, very well and being very integrated into the community so that you see that talent coming up, and then you go after that talent aggressively so that you can get them to join the team.
And I'll just mention one of the things we've done at SESYNC is, because our teams here are so diverse, if someone wants to organize a workshop around their particular topic they're building a group around, we require that they can only identify a certain number of the individuals that will come and speak. And then we advertise that symposium, and we invite applications to speak that describe very briefly, in less than a page, what they can contribute, what their expertise is, et cetera. And it brings in people you did not know existed, and that can be pretty effective. I believe, Leslie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think if you do effective outreach and you're a really good collaborator, then people are going to come to you as well, because the community out there is going to hopefully have your name in mind when a discussion comes up and someone says, oh, you should contact this person, you know, if you're looking to achieve this goal. So, I mean, obviously we want to be out there looking for collaborators, but again, you know, if you create the right environment, the collaborators will come to you.
Mm-hmm. Other comments, input? Well, I believe it's time for a break. So thank you very much for a great session, both Guy and Roberto and the group out here.
Welcome back, everybody who's in the room, and especially to those who are watching the webcast from afar. Our last session this afternoon is Tools to Build and Sustain Dispersed Networks of Networks. And this session will focus on topics around common challenges and techniques associated with communication and collaboration of dispersed networks of networks. I'm really pleased to have our two speakers here today. Our first speaker is Dr. Cynthia Parr, who's a technical information specialist in the Knowledge Services Division at USDA ARS, which is located at the National Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland. Dr. Parr received a BS in biology from Cornell and an MS and PhD from the University of Michigan. And at the National Agricultural Laboratory, she focuses on strategic planning, policy, and leadership for open data and big data initiatives. Dr. Parr.
All right, so I'm going to be talking today about tools, but before I get to that, I want to say, just coming at the very end of a long day of talks, you tend to want to change what you were planning to say, and so I can say after seeing all of these other talks that they seem to fall into a couple of categories. One is people who are experts in the science of teams or collaboration, and the other is people who have experienced and have learned from those experiences of working in networks or networks of networks. And I fall into the latter category. I don't claim any special expertise in the science of what we're doing. I've just learned by doing. And then the other two kinds of talks I've seen are ones that are diving deeply into particular case studies and talking about the lessons learned from those, and others who are taking more of an overview approach and talking about a lot of different examples, and I fall into that latter category. So I'm going to start by basically focusing on just 5 lessons that I've learned through a number of case studies. And I'll start here and I'll end here as well. So the first one is that data networks and collaboration networks reinforce each other. And so by data networks, these are the kinds of tools that I'm mostly going to talk about. I'm not going to talk as much about the communication tools that collaborations might require. I'll be focusing on data sharing and platforms that help facilitate and cause those networks to actually succeed. We found that it's unrealistic to expect shared standards in that data sharing, at least initially, and sometimes ever. It's very important to start with clear stakeholders and well-scoped, potentially experimental projects. These are the sorts of things that NSF is very good at funding. But then move or link those successful approaches into sustainable platforms. So the standard thing at NSF is when you're on a fairly short funding cycle and you spin up some new platform or tool, and then once the grants are over, you either are scrambling to get funding for another round of grants, or it dies and things disappear. And so now at USDA, I'm more in a position to help towards longer term sustainability of at least those successful tools or data sets. I will say that tools that developers use, like GitHub for code repositories and Slack and telecom scrums, do seem to work well for highly distributed teams. And as I'll mention later, that's not just for people who are working on code, but people who are working on procedures and policy and decision making. And this point has been made multiple times before, that program managers are invaluable. And I will say that this is a lesson that I have seen learned over and over again by a lot of projects that did not start this way but ended this way. So in these case studies, I won't name specifics here, but I will say that several of these started with no notion of having a project manager, and they now have them. So I'm going to start with case studies in the biodiversity realm, which was my original domain of expertise. So this is the world that Gil was talking about earlier today. And in each of these examples, I'm going to name the collaboration network first, so biodiversity information standards, and then within that, the two data sharing or tool platforms that have helped those collaboration networks succeed. Then I'll move to the agricultural world, and don't worry about these acronyms, I'll be explaining them as I go along. ARS is my part of USDA, the Agricultural Research Service, but some of the work that we're doing actually goes beyond just our part of USDA. AgBioData goes beyond USDA. This is agricultural biodiversity databases, and so it's partly driven by what's happening at USDA, but it also goes beyond USDA. The Earth Biogenome Initiative is not a project that I personally am working on, but this is an international collaboration that USDA is contributing to. And then finally, AgNIP is a modeling community that is also international and funded both by NSF and by NIFA, the extramural funding agency of NSF. So I don't claim that the lessons that we've learned are the only lessons you can learn from these. And let's see, I'm going to focus primarily on the positives. We can talk about challenges in discussion, but I'm going to focus on the positive things we've learned. So my first case study is Biodiversity Information Standards, which is an organization that's been around for about 34 years. The acronym is TADWIG for historical reasons, Taxonomic Databases Working Group. And this is my favorite network of networks diagram. This was in a paper that we published in 2012. And it is actually illustrating data flows between projects. There was a database of about 1,600 databases that TADWIG maintained, and we took those databases and mapped out who was sharing data with whom. And you can see that there's quite a lot of networks that focus on particular kinds of data. So BHL is the Biodiversity Heritage Library, NCBI, of course, is GenBank and its associated databases. And then there are a bunch of dots here that aren't connected at all. And at the time, I was primarily interested in these projects here in the middle that were connected to multiple hubs. And I thought, that's really interesting. And in most cases, those turned out to be particular projects where there was a single, highly collaborative individual who made those connections happen. And then, of course, these bigger hubs relied on a fair amount of funding and sustainable activity, and most of those are still in existence. I really would love to go back now that I've looked at this figure again, and I want to go back and see, okay, of those ones that aren't in there, how many of them still exist? Because my hypothesis would be is that by connecting with these hubs, some of those smaller projects have been able to sustain themselves and be very active and continue to contribute to the overall network of networks. TADWIG is composed primarily of interest and task groups, and their primary goal is to create standards. And so there's an annual meeting. This is the community that I know has been mentioned before. When you're the only person in your institution, you don't have anybody to talk to. TADWIG is the place where people around the world go to talk about the things that they do day to day, but they have nobody to talk to about. So I think it's been a very important social context in which all of this technical work can happen. So I'm going to focus on two of those hubs. The first one is GBIF, and Gil mentioned that earlier. That's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And I just pulled this off the website, earlier today. And so you can see that there's a very large number of different institutions that are publishing data in this aggregated network. Most of those are museums, but some of them are observation networks. They're collecting, at the data set level, 46,000 different data sets. But within those data sets, if you count it up, there's 1.3 billion occurrence records. And again, that's both museum specimens and observation records. It turns out the observation records are kind of swamping the museum records because they're coming in real time. And there's lots of people out there. If I go back quickly, you can see GBIF's network is composed of some sub-networks. So this is the Avian Knowledge Network, and obviously the bird folks are out there adding data at huge numbers, but there's other resources, like I think Leslie was talking about Butterfly Network, so there's other communities like that that are feeding into GBIF. All right, and I will say just as a comment that I think GBIF has been a success primarily because the work of TADWIG developed a standard that everybody eventually jumped onto and agreed to use, and in turn that has fed back to the work of TADWIG, and so as the network finds gaps or ways that they want to extend that standard, they then go back to TADWIG and hammer out what's needed to do that. Okay, Encyclopedia of Life is the project led by the Smithsonian Institution that I used to work on, and I will say that this also came out of the work of TADWIG in some part, at least the mechanisms that we use. Encyclopedia of Life harvests data from some of these distributed databases. In some cases, those are taxon-specific databases. In some cases, it's the type of data. And over the years that Encyclopedia of Life has been in being, they've moved from being very text and image based. So for every species in the planet, there would be the information that we could get in text or images. But it's moved in part due to some work that I did while I was there to focusing more on capturing structured trait data. And again, this is harvested from non-standardized databases, but then brought into this collective whole and is now generally producing great science because it's been brought together in a standardized way. Okay, so let me move to agriculture now. So I'm in the Agricultural Research Service. This is the intramural part of USDA, and there are about 800 different research projects going on in any given year. There's about 2,000 scientists and postdocs distributed across 90 locations, both in the United States and also a few overseas. And so you can imagine that even though it's a government agency with a fair amount of top-down control over the research that these people do, they're very dispersed, and it's hard to keep them pointed in the same direction, tackling big questions in a coordinated fashion. And so a few years ago, ARS created the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Initiative, and those of you who are familiar with LTER, this is the agricultural, I won't say equal because they're a little bit different. LTER is also fairly dispersed and not necessarily top-down coordinated. So it's LTAR is a little more coordinated than LTER, but maybe not as coordinated as the NEON network. So they're really trying to find that happy medium. And so it's 18 different sites distributed around the country. Some of them are also LTER sites. The general goal is to study ways to increase productivity of our agricultural systems, increase rural prosperity, while trying to reduce as much as possible the impact on the environment. And so they've selected these sites in different watersheds to try to cover the span of crop systems and other agricultural systems across the United States. There's also, I think, some sites that may be coming online in Canada as well. But it's been a few years, and they've been working very much to build this network to get the cultural systems and the data systems in place. And so the data system that is emerging is called AgCross, Agricultural Collaborative Research Outcome Systems, and it is a network of networks itself. They are basically managing a number of different networks that are focusing on specific domains. So GraceNet has been around for a while. It's greenhouse reduction and something conservation. I'm not sure what it stands for. NuoNet is nutrient research. That's starting to become a thing. And then here's another one, agricultural antibiotic resistance. So these are a bunch of different, fairly disciplinary specific research communities that have now agreed to feed their data into AgCross, which at its heart is both a catalog of all these different data sets, but also they are moving towards integrating the data into a single database. And so in order to do that, they're right now in the process of identifying all the measurements that are being taken across all these sites and all of these different disciplinary networks to create sort of the master catalog. And so that's an ongoing process. They've made the decision to go this way, and hopefully that will accelerate the work that this network can do. And then Ag Data Commons is what I am managing at the National Ag Library, and we have a part to play here. So AgCross is primarily seeing its role as enabling the research for their own network, and Ag Data Commons will be the point of access for people outside the network to discover the data, to potentially download it and make their own use of it without necessarily dragging down this platform here. So we're very public-facing, and so they like that. So let me talk a little bit about what Ag Data Commons does. Our primary goal is to make data more fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We are also both a catalog and a data repository, so we want to inventory all the data that USDA has funded. But when data does not have a home, we will find a place for it in the Ag Data Commons. And we're satisfying the requirements at the federal level for open data and also public access to data that's funded for research. We cover a whole span of topic areas, everything from economics to genomics to GIS data. It's very high level, so we don't have specialized tools for the most part to work with the data. We're not a workspace. We're basically an access point. So Ag Data Commons is itself a network of networks. So AgCross, I already mentioned, has its own networks, but these are examples of a bunch of other networks that are each specializing in a particular kind of data. I'll talk about AgBioData in a moment. Green Global is the repository for germplasm information, and so it is a platform that's used not only by USDA, but by other seed banks around the world. I5K I will talk about again in a few minutes, but this got a little messed up, but the Ag Data Commons essentially is working to connect with our high-performance computing system so that we can store big data and make it easy to reuse. We also connect with PubAg, which is the public access system for our scholarly articles, so we do a lot of linking of the data with the articles that they support. And we're tagging with some keywords, a controlled vocabulary that's been developed that is hopefully going to help standardize the metadata a bit. But in general, we're standardizing metadata at a high level so that we can then feed it to these other more externally facing entities like data.gov, science.gov. We're not yet set up to do this, but we hope to be crawlable by Google pretty soon for Google Dataset Search. And then finally, we're implementing ORCID support, which will be the unique identifiers for each researcher, so that should help a lot. And then finally, Vivo, I won't talk about much, but it's a collaboration tool that is being used at other universities to basically capture the network of researchers and the work that they do. So we'll take care of all of that so that these folks don't have to. They can focus on their research. All right, AgBioData is a consortium of about 30 different databases, mostly genomics, and they have a variety of different platforms, but they have just submitted a proposal to NIFA, the extramural granting agency for USDA, to try to do essentially a combination between an RCN and also to develop some infrastructure. And that infrastructure would connect them to the Ag Data Commons so that we can take care of all those other things, compliance, connections to the outside world, and they can focus on building towards standardization within these databases. All right, Earth Biogenome Initiative. I know probably Stuart and other folks here may have heard of this. This is the international initiative to sequence all of life. And so I just throw this up here in part because they have a representative governance structure that includes all of these different international entities with a coordinating council in the middle, some particular data systems and infrastructure around the outside. So I think that fits in a lot with what we've already been talking about. They have very ambitious goals that I won't go into, but the point of this is that USDA's contribution here is going to be to provide resources to sequence 100 agricultural pests that are very important, and they've chosen to use the I5K workspace at NAL, which is an existing data product that they can then reuse to support this work. So they're not going to build new infrastructure, at least we're not. They're going to reuse something that was already in existence. All right, the last case study here is AgMIP. This is the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement project, and this has been around for a while, funded in part by NSF, and they have done international meetings to coordinate with crop modelers around the world to come up with some standard vocabulary so that all of these different crop models, which all take data in different formats but share a lot of the same variables that go into those models, that they can build translators so that you can do ensemble modeling, much like you would see in the weather or climate arena. So they basically now have some tools that can be used, but these have all been relatively short-term NSF or other kinds of funding, and so they can't sustain this infrastructure. And so that's why they're now working with us. And I won't go into the details here, but the idea is that Ag Data Commons will take on some of the more sustainable things that will enable these distributed data sets that are in different databases to make it easy to discover the data sets that might be relevant for a modeler, to map those, to keep the mappings of those particular data sets variables to ontologies, so that then makes them available through the semantic web, mapping those ontology terms to this unified controlled vocabulary that they already have developed, and then make it possible to quickly search all of this data so that you can download the stuff that you want. So this is just beginning. It is funded. We have a funded piece of it to do a little bit of development work that builds on our current platform to add these tools to it to hopefully make this much more sustainable going through the future. And in the end, if the data here disappears, which I don't think it will because those are all using professional repositories, we at least will have the work that's been done in a sustainable repository platform. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my lessons learned, and I don't need to repeat a lot of this, but I think you can hear from my descriptions that there's definitely examples where we didn't start off with shared standards. We don't really expect that there's going to be shared standards. There may be translators that will help bring the data together in a usable way. In all of these cases, I would say that the creation of a data network has fed back onto the collaboration networks and back and forth. And so having a concrete system for the network to work on has provided real focus for these networks and helped them succeed and decide where to go in the future. And yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say for now. So thanks a lot for listening. Oh, one more thing to say is, as I said, I'm not part of a lot of these projects. These are people who are involved, some of whom provided slides to me, but some of them don't even know I'm giving this talk. So any errors of fact were mine alone.
Thanks for a terrific talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Owen White, professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Dr. White is an internationally recognized expert in bioinformatics, and he leads a group of over 25 scientists and engineers at the Institute for Genome Sciences, who are collectively responsible for the development of nearly all production-level annotation pipelines, database systems, and tools for automated and manual annotation of genomes and metagenomic data sets at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Medicine.
Okay, if I was going to do a case study of case studies, you win. That was very good. And what she presented that you were referring to as the Ag Data Commons, this is basically a presentation of the biomedical data commons, and we use nearly identical strategies. And I will, I think, talk a little bit more about survival tactics of working with consortia and what's involved there after I just sort of introduce the domain. So this is a kind of a classic calendar that's been around for a while, where this is the kind of the timeline that NHGRI, the way it perceives itself, which is one of the institutes within NIH in terms of how it's generated a lot of genomic sequencing. And if I sort of bump to this period in time, there was a point when essentially we were just taking lots of different individual species and generating the sequence for them. And now we live in kind of a different world. So all of these science articles and nature articles represent projects that I've been involved with. Arabidopsis was a large international effort where they broke up the chromosomes literally of Arabidopsis and had different centers sequencing them, and then down the line. And the theme here is that you would take some charismatic macro species, you know, some individual organism, grind up the DNA, run it through the sequencing pipeline, and run it back into a computer to assemble them all together. The difference started to happen. One of the inflection points was right here with microbiome studies, where you were generating sequence of collections of bacteria. And now we live in a world where you don't have to understand this slide very much, but we take individual tissues and run them through a single cell sequencer and generate a whole genome from a single cell. And the throughput now is just astronomical. So one of the things that I thought would be part of my mission for coming here is to say that we now exist in kind of this world where data acquisition is the name of the game in biomedical science. And originally the human genome took 3 years to generate for a single genome. The Broad Institute now brags about sequencing a human genome every 5 minutes. And so we were looking at having millions of genome equivalents, and there's many implications of this. And it used to be that there were just a few shining genome centers that were generating the data. Now sequencing is just distributed all over the place. And what I'm involved with are these really large cloud-based systems. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these are really, from my perspective at least, for really large projects. They're incredibly well funded. So there's a number of things to know now in terms of some of the kind of inflection points that we've kind of hit. There used to be a genome repository referred to as GenBank or NCBI, and that's gone. It's like we have PubMed still that is the central repository for a lot of publications. Think of it now as that there's now going to be many repositories for that type of information. There's going to be now distributed repositories for storing genomic data. It's not going to be at any one site. NIH has hundreds, let's say, of coordinating centers. Each coordinating center is coordinating across many clinical groups that are generating this data. So I guess just that we're talking about tens of thousands of labs, and God knows I'm just totally guessing with the number of samples that they're processing. But I'm involved with the Brain Initiative project for an atlas of brain cells, and there's hundreds of thousands of these single cell data points that are coming from serial sections from mouse brains and human brains. So it's just an amazing thing. And let me layer on top of this that it won't be long that thousands of hospitals will be using genomic sequencing just as an assay. And that will completely swamp out some of these gee whiz numbers that I've already talked about. So one implication of this is there's now even more, as if there ever wasn't, an emphasis on open access for data. And things like you mentioned FAIR, a term I always try to stay away from, but I like the term discoverability. I just would like to, as a taxpayer, I'd just like to know where all these data sets are. And so there's a high premium on this, but it's actually still incredibly hard to combine data sets from one site to another, as anybody who's running a data commons starts to know. And forget about reproducibility, like the provenance of where this sequence came from. It's very challenging. So let me walk you through one example of this. I represent the NIH Common Fund, which is another institute, and they have on the order of 10 data coordinating centers. And if I look at the data types that are associated with them and put an X in there and say, do they have ChIP-seq or do they have FISH? These are all different sequencing technologies. What you can see here is that there's a big diversity of data. But another implication of this is that if I refer to sequence that came from the RNA of a cell versus the DNA, whatever, I'll call each one of those things an asset, okay? There are many assets that you can find across sites, but the other thing that's really important is there's many assets that are useful in combination with each other. And that's wonderful. You'd like to be able to engage in comparison of data from one place to another. And again, you've introduced this very well, that the life is now about integration of this. So if I were to describe the problem, there is no electronic specification for each individual asset. So there were these great 1,000 points of light pictures of collecting samples from all over the planet, and I'd love to know more about this, but eventually those are, some type of data acquisition that's happening. And my question would be, are those laboratories, have they sort of cracked through the barrier that we have not cracked through, which is just to describe each data collected, each sample that's collected by a device in the same way so you can find them in some way. So and the other issue is that there are plenty of people who are generating these things, but there's no specification for describing all the inventory of all the assets that any one place has. And there is definitely no transport system. So if I want to capture this and capture this, glue them together, go to some computing platform to analyze them, there's not a universal way to do that. So one of the things that I want to say is there might be a high premium on all of these things. And again, our previous speaker probably knows this from painful experience. I would label these as being nearly irrelevant technological issues and much more sociological issues about bringing these data sets together. And I'll describe a bit about what that is. So You mentioned metadata. Our life is essentially always, if I'm talking about genome standards, it's essentially about coming to agreement. And one of the things that's very clear is the only way that we can pull together data based on metadata is through community engagement. This is a product of scholarship. I looked up the other day that the Dewey Decimal System has actually been developed for over 100 years, and they had release after release after release, and this is a product of an incredible amount of scholarship, and this is no different. So in the world that I live in, for the disease ontology, just describing things like disease, one of the people that I'll talk about in just a second, who's basically a curator of bringing in control vocabularies that describe disease, and there's many different control vocabularies, is basically working with this constellation of people. And what Lynn Schrimmel has done as a curator of these is to take these really important control vocabularies, ICD-9, which are used by hospitals and describe disease in a certain way, or mesh terms, or OMIM. What she's done is she's created mappings across all of these systems. So she's bringing in these collections of control vocabularies and working with these different centers to be making essentially an interconnected mapping between all of these. And it, again, my main thing is that this is really about, you have to do this in consultation with a very large community. So one of the things that we get into is this is sort of when I want to be organizing my thoughts around getting a collaboration or a consortium together. I keep in mind that I frame everything in terms of fairness and trust. That's just part of my background, or because I'm a Pisces or something like that. But the idea is that all the stakeholders have to have a vested interest, and we heard lots of people already talk about this. There are problems in lots of consortia that there's actually not that much investment for people to really want to come to the table, so that's pretty hard. One of the big things that I bet you may be experiencing is, picture a satellite of data generators, or a satellite of lots of different data collection sites. They are faced with the prisoner's dilemma, which is no one individual group can get buy-in across the group, or you can't really start data sharing unless you know that everybody in your consortia are going to participate. And the problem here with this is that usually a lot of people come to the table with a lot of bias. Okay, so getting buy-in for any different approach, it's very hard for an individual center to do that because everybody basically mistrusts each other, and that's a really big deal. So let me just stop for a second before I talk a little bit more about some of what I would consider successful approaches, and just say that when it comes to consortia, I interpret everything in terms of fairness and trust. And backing up a little bit further, I also think about it very much in the context of natural history, where humans were basically faced with two problems: collaborate or compete. You know, like work together or bash open the skull of the people you were competing against. And there's a constant tension in our field of this balance between collaboration and competition, and people having to decide between what they have to do. And in my view, one of the biggest things that breaks through the competition versus collaboration decision has to do with trust. Okay, so I organize a lot of my thinking around trust. So this has already been said, but let me just sing the praises of lots of open access tools like Google Drive, GitHub, Slack. What happens here? You're open about everything, and all your processes and all that development is shared across the group. That is one way to build up trust. Other drivers for success, and again, I'll just point out that this is probably true throughout the course of natural history. What we are doing right now by going to different data coordinating sites is we are essentially a communication team, and we go on listening missions. We engage in physical travel to these different coordinating sites, and we never talk about implementation. We never say, "Jeepers, can I get you to buy into a particular control vocabulary?" Not a chance. We sit down and just listen to their story, and we want to see what their life is like, and people are very, very happy to talk about themselves. And then we can start to determine some incentives for them to want to participate in the larger thing. And often what we do is as a result of this, we disseminate a lot more information about what the consortium is about. And we also make sure that the funder isn't in the room, because people aren't going to speak frankly. So the thing here is you're raising trust by actually just sort of walking a mile in people's shoes. And there's an enormous value to actually just seeing what each participant is actually wants to sort of bring to the table, and you promote buy-in that way. So do not underestimate the value of a communication team. Another example, and people have mentioned this a billion times, is the value of working groups. There is now a sort of a teleconferencing lifestyle that is incredibly accessible. And the one thing I want to mention is that there is both a type of vertical integration where you could be talking about people at the steering committee and what's happening with the boots on the ground, but then you also want people who are sort of peer-to-peer talking to each other, so I'll call that a horizontal communication. And it's a way that when you get people who are from one site and another site that are dealing with the same problems, they're going to open up a lot more, and they're going to value being seen by their peers. So just keep in mind that that's valuable. And the other thing that I would say that it's already been said really is that decisions should not be based on who can attend. Okay, you want to write everything up, you want to publicize. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned, the entire internet was developed based on developing protocols for IP addresses and a lot of different things through the use of requests for comments. The idea behind requests for comments is that they're open, you write something up, you give some people an opportunity to react to it. They're highly iterative, but eventually they help you make binding agreements. I also want to say that academics, for the most part, just don't want to build standards, so this is one way of sort of competing against that. And it eventually triangulates on consensus and community agreement. That's fair, okay? People had a chance to buy in. People had a chance to make comments. So I would just say, keep that in mind as something that's been very important. I'm just sort of, streaming all my different ideas about ways that you can succeed with building up agreements across people. We've already said this a billion times, record everything, disseminate everything, and there's very different approaches to that. What we have done is make use of GitHub, versioning, allowing people to record comments there, a lot of different things like that. Slack, I am a PI of a large consortium that at one point was about 500 people. It shrunk in terms of its scope. The main thing that I did was sit on Slack and answer questions for people across the consortium. And there's kind of a football coach mentality here, where the football coach is talking to every member of the team and actually trying to find out what their life is like and trying to help them understand what the bigger picture is. And I really value that. The other thing is that football coaches is they sort of represent on behalf of the funding agent what they're thinking, and it lets people kind of just do their thing. So anything that you can do to promote that everyone is being seen, consortium-wide meetings, promoting, like throwing funding towards pairwise interactions, recording what a more senior data coordinating group is doing so that could get passed on to a new data coordinating group is very useful in both directions. People value that. We do take advantage of things like newsletters and social media. So another aspect of promoting fairness for us, because we have to do a lot of technical development, is comparisons of different tools that are out there. So we frequently have things that are basically bake-offs. They're objective tests for validating if one thing works. We engage in agile development all the time. This is sort of our lifeblood, and is another way when you're working with multiple groups. In the agile approach, I could go into more detail, actually promotes fairness because there's a lot of bake-offs. There's a lot of comparisons, and you sort of, if you don't like it, you just start over again. Training, we take training very seriously, so maybe what I'll do is just jump to a couple notes that I made. We haven't talked that much about interactions with the end user. We haven't talked that much about developing and creating a larger on-ramp for the community of consumers that's using the data for any of these large networks. This is another important role of documentation. This is another important role for having all that stuff on the web. We engage in a lot of outreach. We like to work with end users, and we like to say this is a training exercise, but our subterfuge is we're actually learning about their usage patterns for interacting with the data. So that translates into use cases that we then build into the website. The last thing I want to mention is do not underestimate the importance of your interactions with the funder. I literally am tasked with writing a health of the consortium report to the funding agent. And I can talk about these are what we consider to be extremely high-risk issues, and they can address them. And also, I did mention earlier, they have project managers now at NIH that I can contact and say, this is a mission-critical issue, and they'll actually act on it. So that's been incredibly valuable. The last thing I'll say about the funders, that they are really excited about what we do from the angle of sustainability, because what we're doing is capturing institutional knowledge for the way that some operations have been doing their thing for 10 years and using that as guideposts for the next data coordinating center that comes along. And they love that idea, because the opposite is these sites that are these beautiful repositories, but they're incredibly expensive to operate, and the NIH has a lot of discomfort with the idea of having a 30-year mortgage for any data set that's being maintained out there. So they really like this idea of sustainability, and I'll end there.
Thank you both for really fascinating talks. I want to open the floor now and also open up for those who are watching on the live stream for questions for our two speakers.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask about the reproducibility challenge that you mentioned, but then on the slides at the end, I didn't see how you are actually tackling that problem. But in addition to reproducibility, also replicating the experiments where the data was collected is also another challenge. And I actually participated in one of the National Academy's reports on this issue specifically, which is becoming a huge issue. So what are the ways in which you would suggest that we can handle this, challenge?
I'll go first, and my answer is, as Owen said, we recognize that reproducibility was essentially an impossible goal for us, so we're not explicitly trying to support it. But at the same time, we're doing our best to capture the richest possible information about how the data were collected, and that might involve, and I'm trying to encourage people to do this, it's a culture change, but post your protocols on protocols.io. Post your Jupyter Notebook up on GitHub. Archive your open source software scripts that you use to analyze your things. So we're trying our best to move the entire research community to these standard practices, but it's far from standard. So I think by at least showing people the bar, we may eventually get people to the bar. And just the presence of the data on the web in its rawest possible form, I think, is going to foster reproducibility.
Yeah, so I mean, you can have a very pessimistic view about this, that it's virtually impossible, and then there are technologies that can be adopted that make it better. So, to give you an idea about how impossible it is, one of the things that happens is for any gene that you sequence, you want to compare it to all the other genes that are out there. Okay, the size of those data sets are really very large. And if you want to reproduce how somebody made an annotation to a gene, you need to kind of make a snapshot of the universe and all the position of the atoms at that time point in order to recreate that. And so that's an example of something that's very hard. There are these new systems that are referred to as Docker, which are ways of essentially bundling up an entire operating system. And that ability to bundle up an entire operating system and stage it somewhere, that's really very nice, because, okay, you can really recreate what was going on in that computer with respect to generating the output that it did. That's a good sign. The protocols.io digital object identifiers, in terms of being able to assign, here's a data collection, and here's a stable identifier that goes with it, and this data collection may be linked to publications. There's a fighting chance, but there is just an abysmal record in my field of people being able to reproduce what happens in publications. And I know some publishers, some editors of journals, one of the things that they're becoming more strident about is requiring that for submission, people have to also submit all the scripts that resulted in generation of figure 1, 2, and 3. And I'm trying to go a step further than that with the Human Brain Consortium that I'm involved with. For each of these figures, they're linked to a DOI. The user would be able to click on it. They'd be able to go to a repository. They'd be able to unpack these things called Jupyter Notebooks, which are basically glorified scripts that allow you to reproduce things. So there's positive stories, but it's very, very challenging.
And I'll just add on to that it may not necessarily be worth the effort for some data sets. And so,
That's right.
So one of the things I'm trying to promote in our community is classifying your data based on how raw to processed it is and maybe what the risks are associated with the different kinds of data so that you can make those priority decisions about what you need the highest standards of documentation for.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. It sounds like we're both very much involved in this sort of a concept called a commons. And one of the enticing pitches that I've tried to make to NIH about the value of a commons is that we can start to more objectively track usage patterns that's happening at multiple sites. So how many new users came to their site, how many downloads of the data, how many times did they take that data and move it over to some other resource. And the pitch, I'm not saying we'll do this, but the sweet inducement that we're trying to get them to buy into is that we are basically an objective site that could look at usage patterns and help them establish priority for which data sets they'd want to keep maintain and which ones they want to just discontinue.
Other questions?
We have an online question there.
Yeah, I'm going to hold the online question because it's a little bit off topic.
Okay.
So I have a question, and I'm not sure if it's unfair or not, but I'm so impressed by what you've done. I'm so impressed by the idea of the commons and just the sheer technical expertise and thought that's gone behind this. You've both mentioned users, the end user. One of the things I think about with the CellNet is, networks of networks have the potential to transform how science is being done. I think you're transforming how science is being done. Can you give examples from each of your worlds where you think that these enabling systems you're building are transforming science?
So I'm going to play devil's advocate and say the jury's still out for the work that we're doing in agriculture. It's really, really tough to find those impacts, partly because there aren't standard ways to collect those metrics. And so I'm working on some, my own research life is like, okay, how do you decide which are the metrics that are important to track and which are feasible to actually monitor? And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on that. Certainly, a lot of what I focus on in agriculture, and maybe you do too, is that there's the stakeholders who are the researchers who need to have access to the data and be able to reuse it so that they can build on it to do bigger, better science. That's a big mantra that I like to use. But at the same time, we're doing it for society. So we also need to make sure that it's accessible to the outside world. And that's challenging, but there are some success stories. So for example, ARS runs a nutrient composition database, and they've got very, very rigorous procedures where they're analyzing the content of food and putting it out there. And in addition to the research that they're enabling, it's been picked up by Google and also by third-party app developers. And now it's on your phone when you're tracking your diet and your consumption. So that's a success story of one particular database. Now imagine if you could bring that nutrient data together with sustainable agricultural practice so that you're raising the bar. So that's the vision. I don't think we're there yet, but we're in position to do it.
So it's a good point about the lay public. We actually, when we develop use cases for our documentation site, one of the personas that we always include in there is what happens if a lay person wanted to know more about whatever. But if I was going to give a couple of my favorite transformative examples, there's a large genomic study that's happening out of the UK, and what's amazing there is that they're tying genomic information, the entire genome sequence of on the order of tens of thousands of people, to healthcare records that are the result of socialized medicine. So they track a lot of information, and it's all handled in a much more robust way than we do. The trends that you can see there, they link things like behavior. There's gene loci that are associated with women's choice to give birth before age 30 versus over age 40. And so trends like that are just, when these are presented at meetings, you can hear people gasp in the room that you can find things like that. My favorite example that I had firsthand with developing this data commons is there's a site called Kids First, where they sequence genomes of kids that have mostly brain cancer. And a researcher contacted them and said, can you do a join between your data set and another coordinating site that looks at stuff at the expression level? We've got 24 hours, but if you can show that the variants that this particular kid has, then we would be able to enroll her in another study. And they were able to do that. And again, when I see something like that, it almost makes you weep. The problem is the coordinating centers were able to do that. They were able to do that because they'd sort of churned on the data. More on the topic of the promise, what we'd want to do is create this on-ramp so lots of clinicians can do that. But yes, I think I've had the heady experience of seeing some real, what would be a result of these types of changes in the landscape.
That's great.
You know.
Leslie?
I want to make a comment because, you know, the vision of what you guys have presented is so alluring. Mm-hmm. And I'm the kind of person who's like, yes, that's the sort of thing I'm trying to do in terms of making data accessible, findable, mm-hmm. you know, and I think as a you know, a professor, just the kind of support I would need, even in my lab where we're pretty savvy about mm-hmm. these kinds of things, to be able to truly implement, being able to share our notebooks and our data and everything's perfectly annotated and the metadata are, you know, using the best standards. It's like, you know, it's hard because even when you're motivated and you understand the challenges and you have a lot of the technical skills, you still don't have the time or the support or even the reward of having done it. And I think that makes it hard.
So here's where I'm going to put in a plug for your libraries because I've already mentioned to somebody else earlier today that libraries are now getting into the data business because, I mean, it's kind of the business they've been in all along. They have the knowledge of how best to go about finding the best practices for your data, finding those data standards. I have curators on my team that will do metadata, that will help with metadata description in order to follow some, you know, most reusable practices. So we're trying, for ag libraries, we're trying to put together a set of discipline-specific best practices so that we can steer people at the planning stages of their research towards those, you know, highly useful, community-driven best practices. Actually, I have a colleague who says, I hate the word best practices. It's like fair, right? So let's just say effective practices that have a community basis. So again, we'll never get there necessarily, but lean on your libraries because they will likely have people who can help. And then also, I guess, the data centers at institutions and research offices should also be beginning to help in this direction.
The stuff that you said resonates for me the most is that I have a colleague who's much more passionate about the training component of this, and he's essentially the co-investigator of this project that I'm talking about. And he has gotten, I don't, if you've heard of the data carpentry, so he was basically one of the movers and shakers of standing that up. And he's gotten into the business of essentially training the trainers. So what they want is people streaming in to be taught how to essentially teach other people to do these types of activities. And his name is Titus Brown, and where he's coming from is it's the people in your lab who are extremely comfortable with navigating a lot of this type of stuff and are really actually at a stage now, a level of sophistication where they're pretty easy to grab up and get shown how to be using these systems that are starting to emerge in a new landscape. So I will just say that I'm hopeful, and I'm incredibly grateful to the NIH because they're allowing us to put a big component of training into this project. And again, they like it from the angle of validation. it's showing that it's actually being used by people. So we've got funding for a couple of postdocs that are just engaged in data usage of the data that we're putting together, because we task them with, you get some funding, but you also write a report and describe to us where you found gaps, and that helps drive the process forward. So it's hopeful, and I also share your pain. I know it's right now it's challenging for everybody.
Let me open up the floor to any other questions that didn't get asked earlier today. I realize it's late in the day. We've got one online question, but I want to keep the floor open. Go ahead.
One more is, what role do you think that AI could have in all this? Because we have some projects with DARPA, for example, in which actually the focus is how to handle huge data sets using AI.
So I will start by saying that I traditionally have been a very, very blue-collar bioinformatics guy, and it's like I need to structure the data, I need to load it in a database, and so for a long time I was fairly dismissive of natural language processing as well as AI. I've seen some absolutely startling examples, and so we're both tasked and challenged with essentially metadata for describing lots of different things. And the key to joining all data sets now really is the metadata, and how do you structure that in a common way. How could I go to eBay and go to Alibaba and ask exactly the same query and get the same results, type of thing. AI, I've seen some solutions associated with that of essentially harmonizing in an automated way, and then letting curators look at that result to really refine it. It's been mind-blowing. So I think that it's very promising. I will say I don't have any boots on the ground real-world experience with it.
So we've been working with a small data science team to sort of explore these kinds of approaches, and it's been very interesting because I also come from the more, you got to structure it on the way in if it's going to be meaningful. Really, it turns out that a lot of it is just you have to have enough verbiage associated with the data set that you can then use NLP to extract some of these concepts. But the other thing is a lot of the AI techniques require a training set. So all of this structured metadata that we put a lot of effort into creating actually should, hopefully, jumpstart those AI approaches that might take over at some level. The other thing is big data doesn't always have a big schema, or it's all the same data. There's just a lot of it, so it's not that hard sometimes to describe it. So I'm hopeful that I'm pushing really hard on data dictionaries right now, where you actually, in a fairly standardized, machine-readable way, capture what are those rows and columns in this particular data set in a human-readable way so that somebody understands what those acronym means, but then ties it to ontology or some other way so that you can start to, using automated methods, associate the data sets that are related to each other, and then maybe integrate them.
Okay, one final question before we break. This pertains to some of the things we talked about earlier. It can be open to anyone in the room. Question relates to maintaining meaningful network connections and activities across time zones when not gathering at planned conferences or workshops. This individual is building an international network of networks focused on permafrost coastal issues in the Arctic. It involves network members that span nearly every time zone. Could someone possibly touch on feasible mechanisms for conducting monthly web-based meetings across time zones?
So I'll tell you what we've done with TADWIG. So when I was chair of the Biodiversity Information Standards Group, I initiated regular monthly meetings, because they hadn't always been meeting. And then we had to have 2 meetings a month, one for the early crowd and one for the late crowd. And for the chair, that was tough because we really needed to be at both of those. But it was otherwise impossible, because when you have people from Australia collaborating with people in California or Europe, it's really tough. So multiple time zones for those teleconferences. But then the other thing is Slack. As a semi-asynchronous, synchronous tool, you can capture conversations and respond to them in real time, but then they're also there for people who aren't awake to chime in on later when they want to catch up.
So we just try to pick the people that are really congenial and are willing to meet at any time of the day or night, like me. And we say, everybody else pick your time and I'll follow suit. And that's worked out pretty well between China, Australia, and the Netherlands. So, I think that's I just always say, I'll do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't care. Just pick a time.
That's actually a really good rule of thumb in general, is there are plenty of people out there who want to collaborate. So you can just kind of ignore the ones who don't. And that's sort of, it's I hate to say it, but they're going to be left in the dust if they're not willing to work well.
But if they're very important, if they're very important, then I can tell this person is not going to meet after 6 their time, or they're not going to meet before 7 their time. So we say, okay, that person's really important to be in this, so let's just schedule it in that time, and some of the rest of us will just adapt.
Well, I mean, it's another chance to emphasize that we place a pretty high premium on recording everything and making any meeting really a matter of record. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. There's a lot of action items that that are outcomes of meeting that we now track in GitHub as GitHub issues. And so there are ways that you can deal with life asynchronously, but let the record reflect it's a pain in the neck that we live on a spherical planet and there's only one sun. Yeah.
Big country.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, let me ask you to thank our speakers for 2 terrific talks. And thank you for a really wonderful day. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning and look forward to talking to you more then. Thanks so much.